So, and one other bit of housekeeping is today's meeting is on the record. It is being live streamed, so feel free to use the information, quote it as you see fit. And, you know, in case you didn't get enough in round one, you can go and re-listen to everything yet again online at the Post. We will be doing some tweeting of the event, and likewise sending out copies of the visual booklet for people to consider. And then again, final report with much more detail will be released in about 2 weeks. So what I'd like to do is take my remaining couple of minutes and just offer a couple of thoughts and highlights on the report itself. So as I mentioned, the project overall is part of the On the Radar project. You want to visit the overall project, which includes the booklet, but also tech primers, country primers, information and analysis on the project that's been going on. You can access that at ontheradar.csis.org for all relevant information. So what is On the Radar? On the Radar is a 2-year study sponsored by the Carnegie Corporation of New York and designed to examine the crisis, stability, and escalation implications of the evolving strategic situational awareness ecosystem. We've had a very strong partnership with University of California, Berkeley, and their Nuclear Policy Working Group under the leadership of Bethany Goldblum and Andrew Reddy, who are co-authors and co-partners on the project. Okay, before we go any further, it's on the first page of the booklet, but what is strategic situational awareness? We have defined it as follows. It is the ability to characterize the operating environment, detect and respond to threats, and discern actual attacks from false alarms across the spectrum of conflict. In other words, it is those capabilities and the ability to produce our understanding of a battle space, our understanding of what is that environment, what is the threat picture, what is there at sort of a fairly strategic level. It does not include any sort of kinetic capabilities. We didn't look at that. We looked at capabilities that are designed to help us understand the information environment and what are the implications of using those capabilities. And the starting question was, because we always think of information, right, all net good, and the pursuit of information as stabilizing and as more situational awareness in a crisis to help reduce miscalculation. So we started with a somewhat counterintuitive question, which was, can there be too much of a good thing? Okay. Embedded in that, we looked at kind of 3 central questions, some of which are addressed in the booklet and which are discussed in far greater detail in the report. What is the strategic situational awareness ecosystem and how has it evolved? We track 3 major periods of that and then basically wind up with an, kind of the environment we believe exists today, which is almost a fully combined strategic situational awareness ecosystem between our conventional and our nuclear responsibilities. The second question was, which technical capabilities will inform the strategic situational awareness environment in crisis and or conflict between nuclear-armed adversaries? You'll see that in the booklet as well, an array of sample technologies that we looked at, everything from UAVs to UUVs to kind of decision support aids through AI or certain cyber capabilities, certain types of space-based capabilities. They are not comprehensive. They are kind of a smattering of a range of different types of capabilities with a desire to kind of take a mission focus. A lot of emerging tech type projects have focused on an individual type of technology, cyber versus AI versus autonomous capabilities of certain kinds. We kind of took a mission look. If the mission of these capabilities is to bring strategic situational awareness, how do we sort of look at that in a more holistic way? And then the final big question being, how can these capabilities decrease or increase escalatory risks in crisis that occur under a nuclear shadow? What's a nuclear shadow? It is a crisis that may be subconventional or conventional in nature, but is occurring with or between or in close proximity to nuclear-armed states in such a way that there is a nuclear overhang even over a more conventional engagement. So why does this matter? Kind of 3 summary points that I'll just speak to quickly. First, we believe that the risk of crisis or conflict between nuclear armed states is increasing. That reflects both a perception of a more dangerous security environment between various nuclear armed states, and it also reflects the fact that there are sort of a growing number overall of contentious relationships involving nuclear armed states, not only sort of United States and China, but for example, the way that North Korea is on the world stage. So it is a more complex environment that is increasing the opportunity for crisis or conflict between states with nuclear weapons. Secondly, we believe certainly the United States and probably other countries as well are increasingly reliant on a single strategic SA-enabled ecosystem for both nuclear and conventional crisis and conflict. So we talk about that a lot more, both in the booklet and the report, but the bottom line is many of the things that might have been used in the past strictly for conventional conflict, such as the ability to use ISR capabilities for targeting, could be relevant in a broader conflict. So there's just more capabilities that are mutually and codependent, rather than having capabilities that were for nuclear early warning being kind of set in one area and fire-braked away from those things that might be used by the conventional warfighter. We believe that space is highly commingled now. And then the final one, and one in which there's some, debate about how new is new, is it an evolution or a revolution, but nonetheless, the rapid advance of technology is changing the nature of the tools, it's producing more information more quickly, there's opportunity for greater precision, but also a lot of challenges for decision makers. So, very quickly, we did a lot of kind of the traditional research that you think of, but we really wanted to sit down and talk to people and engage them in a kind of policy discussion and force them to think about what kind of decisions they might make in a crisis with regard to the use of strategic situational awareness capabilities. This is a quick snapshot. This is discussed a lot more detail in the report, but basically we ran 8 different tabletop exercises with 2 major scenarios, one being North Korea related, one being China related. We had 150 different participants overall, a wide variety of participants, senior, former government officials. We did one for each scenario with that group. We also did it at pony conferences, pony meetings, nuclear scholars, and other settings with a pretty diverse group. I'll just tell you kind of bottom line up front on that. Not tremendously big differences in the nature of the discussion, the types of questions, or the reservations that those groups brought up, whether it was with our more junior participants or with the more senior. They actually came to some pretty similar conclusions. All right, so speaking of conclusions, let me just highlight 4 big takeaways, and then we'll get right into today's discussion. First, I think conclusion number 1 is we believe the growing nuclear shadow requires new perspectives on the value and achievability of information dominance, even in conventional conflicts. But as an extension of that, it also requires some new perspectives on how we use and signal and communicate with regard to the capabilities associated with information dominance. And so we talk about that quite a bit. So decisions about how to use ISR or how to use kind of predictive AI or how other things really change some of the calculus that decision makers might bring, and something that I'll talk about in a few minutes, but decision makers may be far more cautious and may bring a certain amount of what we call escalation anxiety to decision making, and may consider differently the use of certain capabilities and trade off some willingness to get more information if they believe the process of getting the information will heighten escalation risk in the conflict. And that is an important thing to think about. The second key conclusion is we really say, look, this combined nuclear, conventional, strategic SA ecosystem is here to stay. It's not gonna, there's no sort of walking back from that. That's our conclusion. And so related to that is that, yes, we need to think about the risk associated with that, but that we realistically, the path to reducing those risks doesn't really lie in trying to disentangle, right? That which is entangled probably cannot be sort of broken apart at this point. So we need to address any risks associated with that, but we'll probably need different tools than sort of a try to go back to a more classic kind of fire-braked strategy. The final one I would just say, and this is really at the heart of why we chose this focus area for today's event, is that the high stakes and unfamiliar technologies associated with these crises and with these situational awareness technologies may increase the risk of biased decision making. And we've really found this over and, kind of repeatedly in the tabletop exercises that we did. We decided to call that pathway of escalation, that way of, that set of escalatory risks, information complexity. And we would argue, we think it's kind of underappreciated as a challenge, as a risk in this environment. And we really felt it was important to focus. And so hence, we decided as our rollout event today to really take that piece on. So I'm thrilled that you're all here. I'm going to invite the panelists of our first panel to come on up. I'll do some introductions. The way we've broken today up is I will sort of moderate the first session, and we're really going to kind of talk big picture and some of the theory in terms of technology and escalation, and I couldn't have better presenters to join us for that topic. And then we'll take a quick break, and then after that, Eric Brewer will come up and moderate a session with Avril Haines and Kath Hicks to try to go okay, with practitioners, what's the difference? How do we think about that? So that is our goal. We will have a lovely reception for you afterwards, and hopefully you will celebrate with us a bit for having kind of hit this milestone. So with that, thank you very much, and I will join them over here. All right. Well, thank you both for being here. So much appreciated. Really excited for this conversation. Let me offer a quick introduction, although I think you both are probably quite well known to this audience. But let me start with Peter Singer, who is a strategist and a senior fellow at New America and a professor of practice at Arizona State University. Peter has several books out, including the most recent. I think you have a new one coming out soon. But Like War, Corporate Warriors, Children at War, Wired for War, Cybersecurity and Cyber War. So a long background in kind of the intersection of technology, policy, and strategy. He's a leading expert on 21st century warfare and has done numerous commentaries. He's served in OSD at Harvard and a number of other great positions. So we're really thrilled to have you here, Peter. And then, of course, we also have Dr. Robert Jervis. So thank you for being here. He is the Adlai Stevenson Professor of International Politics at Columbia, and he's been a member of the Political Science Department there since 1980. He's held numerous professorial appointments at the University of California at Los Angeles, Harvard. He has served as the president of the American Political Science Association. He's co-editor of Cornell Studies in Security Affairs, and his publication list is truly impressive. It includes Perception and Misperception in International Politics, The Meaning of the Nuclear Revolution, several other Why Intelligence Fails, and The Psychology of, or How Statesmen Think, The Psychology of International Politics. So definitely a luminary in the field. So thank you so much for being with us here today. We're going to kind of do this in a question style, and I have teed up a whole bunch of questions that I want to ask them. I will go for a few minutes, and then there'll be a chance for you all to ask some questions as well. What I'd like to do in that, if I may, Dr. Singer, is ask you to go first. As you point out in so much of your writing, both nonfiction, like Wired for War, but even fiction too, which I know you use to kind of communicate things that you think are going to penetrate the audience better in a fictional mode, but that have real substantive points to go behind them. You talk about how technology is reshaping the potential battlefield, and in particular, the information environment, which you've addressed, and the roles of robotics, autonomy, AI, and more. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you think the most important technological trends are that are shaping this strategic situational awareness environment, and kind of how you see that landscape unfolding. And maybe you can share with us whether you're in the evolution or revolution camp as well.
Sure. So first, let me begin by thanking you for inviting me and congratulate you on the report. I think you hit it there in the listing. There's a variety of technology areas, clusters, however you want to define them, that are emerging. And I do think they are more revolutionary than evolutionary in that they are presenting us with a new set of questions of not only what is possible, but also questions of what is proper, issues of right and wrong. And it might be right and wrong ways to behave in a crisis, or it might be right and wrong in terms of tactical but also legal or ethical questions that were very much science fiction just a generation ago. And those technology areas range. It's unmanned systems of all types, air, land, sea, underwater, etc. They range in size. You might put another trend in terms of miniaturization, and that of course hits things that we think of as robotics, and then things that we don't, but in some ways are small satellites, and that revolution that it's presenting. It's also software advances, and the software advances might be artificial intelligence, and there's lots of different definitions around that, but it's basically using machine intelligence to somehow mimic or surpass human decision making, and by that we mean it might be able to ingest more data, it might be able to come to decisions quicker, or, and this crosses with the idea of big data, it might be able to pull out ideas, concepts, connection points that humans wouldn't be able to do otherwise. That crosses though with another software area, which is how it's all networked together. And it's networked together. The internet itself is changing. It's emerging to become an internet of things. So all of those different devices, be they a robotic system that's flying to a sensor that fishermen are putting out at sea to track tuna, but it might also be picking up whiffs of data on when a ballistic missile submarine goes by. Essentially, you take that, and the data shows that we're reaching soon to a point of over 1 trillion, with a T, sensors out there of some kind collecting information. And then we have the other big software change, and that's social media. That we don't just have all these collections of sensors, but we're also constantly sharing. And the result of that, if we think about trends real quickly, and you touch on a number of them, one is proliferation, the situational awareness, the kind of tool sets that were just in the hands, not of the superpowers, but really just of the US. Now they're in so many different hands. It might be a small state like a North Korea, or it might be a group of civilian open source intelligence enthusiasts. That proliferation leads to a change in kind of, you might think of the world's become a panopticon. Almost your every move is observed and talked about. And so to give real world examples of that, we've already seen the United States, to your North Korea crisis in the future, actually the last crisis that we had, we tried to move Patriot missile batteries in the dead of night, and they were being talked about on social media within 30 minutes. So North Korea didn't need satellites to do targeting or find out about US military movements, it just needed internet access. Or you and I were at an exchange, I remember, where people were floating the idea of maybe we can go back to the 1980s and have ballistic missiles mobile mounted and traveling around on trucks inside the United States. And my reaction was that, wow, you just created an entire industry of people whose sole hobby will be tracking and talking about movements of these missiles in the United States, a lot like kind of the train spotters.
Yeah.
So you got that, but then the final part of it that you hit on, so you've got this panopticon, but we also have new threats on these same networks: cyber war, hacking of the networks, like war, hacking of the people on them. And so we move from a world where it's about trying to get information for situational awareness to there's lots of information out there. It's what do I trust? How do I validate it? And again, I don't think policymakers are ready for that.
Yeah. That definitely kind of fits with some of what we felt we were observing, which is it wasn't just how do potential policymakers adjudicate information or even just process quantities of information, but how do they assign value? You know, how do you assign a level of confidence in traditional intelligence terms to all these different kinds of things? It's incredibly difficult. Just a quick follow-up on that. You know, in our report, we find that while the United States has enjoyed information dominance and the tremendous asymmetric advantage it provides in conventional conflicts with non-nuclear adversaries, we are starting to question both the achievability and the utility or benefit of information dominance in the current or potential future. In other words, either because it brings so much risk or because it may be almost unachievable in the environment you described. Do you have any thoughts on that perspective?
You know, it's interesting. We're used to having this asymmetry where it's to our benefit. And we are entering a space where there may be opposite asymmetries that come from just the sheer nature of the system of government and democracy that we're lucky enough to live in. And look, we've grown comfortable with that asymmetry in other realms. Vis-a-vis North Korea, nuclear power, North Korea has far better cyber defense than the United States. Not because it is more skillful, but because it is just not as vulnerable because it's not an open system. It does not have a highly networked economy. And so we're comfortable with that because we get all the good stuff of the internet. It's a similar thing if we think about the realm of social media weaponization. China has all sorts of control measures around information and its spread, what people are allowed to talk about, and if they do, they risk being jailed or not. And so we don't have a symmetry of information in them. I'm okay with that. The result that we have freedoms that they don't. It also means that we're seeing play out right now relative to the coronavirus. They have chosen public security over health security. So they have engaged in certain things to engage in disinformation, censorship related to public health. I'm okay with that asymmetry in these other spaces, but again, it's we've been accustomed to the flip side, where we're the ones having that asymmetric advantage, and it just in many ways kind of needs a reorienting of it, and maybe accepting certain types of risks.
Yeah, that's a great point. So, Dr. Jervis, kind of turning to some of the theory here in terms of how we think about escalation. You know, in our study, as I mentioned, it kind of suggests that escalation through what we call information complexity, which we've kind of defined as a decision maker's inability to seek, manage, and interpret information effectively. We sort of feel it might be an underappreciated concern when it comes to managing escalation in crisis. So I noted in How Statesmen Think, you said, little attention was paid to the impact on stability of how people process information, draw inferences on what others are likely to do, and analyze their own alternatives. And I saw that and I went, oh gosh, I feel like we tabletopped that. So it was really interesting. What do you think, as technology develops and the opportunity for higher fidelity information to inform crises grows, what do you see as the benefits and the risks associated with this information complexity?
Yeah, but I think the basic point you make in the reports is 2 points I want to underscore that are very good. One is more information may not be better. The other is any crisis we're likely to see will be under the nuclear shadow. I think there's been a tendency, certainly until maybe a few years ago, but even continuing to downplay nuclear weapons. After all, we now know We've got conventional weapons with great accuracy that can do nuclear used to. We've got cyber that is something that can go to where we didn't before. Nuclear weapons, oh well, we're familiar with them. They don't matter very much, but they don't matter until they do. And you get a crisis of any seriousness, and suddenly people are, wait a minute, 4 steps down the line, this could involve what Kennedy called the final failure. And this is partly new, but partly not. The quote you had is from a recent book, but the book is essays, and that essay was middle of the Cold War. And so the problem has always been with us. Partly it's after all, the warning systems of the 50s and 60s were new at that time, and we've always had basic changes in the informational environment meeting brains that don't change very fast. Now, skipping to today, it really, most of the decision makers on all the relevant countries, well, except for North Korea, didn't grow up with electronics. Right? They, I think, know where the switch is to turn it on and off, but probably not a lot more. And I wonder, just to be looking to 20 years from now, when you have people like some of the younger people here who've grown up doing, like my grandchildren having at least 2 screens open at the same time, it may rot their brains, but it may mean that they'll be sort of more comfortable with certain sorts of situations than people who are decision makers now. But I think the basic problem is that most warning and information systems are designed by people who are technologically very skilled. That's their expertise. And they're not expert in the next steps. Well, what are people going to do with that? How are people going to use the short end, making these systems user-friendly? I mean, we see this in the civilian side all the time. I think it's true here as well. And it's very hard to meld the two, because the people who are developing the sensors and the information systems, they're enormously, I don't have to tell you, you've worked in the government, both of you, I have, enormously challenging and complex. And the things you need to do to get that right, that's more than enough for you to worry about. But there's usually this real gap between the people who've designed that and then the people who are taking the information in. And again, this isn't entirely new. Go back, look at many of the surprise attacks in all of history, in 20th century. Pearl Harbor's a nice example. The radar operator saw the Japanese planes on their way to attack Pearl Harbor. Quite clear, the system was primitive, but it worked well. There they were. What happened? Well, it's a long story, but the short answer is nothing. Both that they thought it was the American reinforcing B-17s coming from the mainland, even though they were coming from the opposite direction. Wasn't clear who it should be reported to. Wasn't clear how you should report it, what you could say about it. The system wasn't set up for the receivers. So, no one had thought at the time, well, what warnings do we have and how are we going to use them? To just continue this for one more minute and then stop. That now, of course, people are more aware of the situation, but this introduces enormous problems because as a generalization, it's pretty good. Human information processing reacts to stress in a U-shaped way. When it's no stress, you're not really putting a lot into it. Get just the right amount. Okay, that's serious. Got to really get my cup of coffee and bear down. But past a certain point, we know that the pressures for premature cognitive closure, avoiding trade-offs, forms of panic, got to move quickly, all that kicks in. Now, of course, the decision makers are not like you and me, or at least not like me. I mean, people who rise to very high levels are really systematically different, and most of them, we hope, are more experienced at, but they're not immune from any of this. So I think people are now aware of these gaps between the information comes in and the way the human mind operates, but being aware, but I don't think we've done enough to really try to narrow the gap.
Yeah, Bridget, it's interesting that several things that you say there, we did observe in a lot of our groups. In several cases, we had sort of technology groups who developed kind of a proposed what we called a collection plan, and then policy groups, right, that would review and approve the plan. Yes. So a lot of times, in some cases, there was a bit of a generational difference between the groups that would just sort of happen because of the nature, kind of the natural demographics that go with people with a lot of high-tech interest tended to be a little bit younger, but also the educational difference was very, very different. And the level of socialization with technology was very different. So I just remember one episode where one of the technical people kind of came out and pulls me aside and is sort of like, I don't understand these people, talking about the policy people, right? And says, they let AI buy their groceries, they work with AI all the time, why does it seem so different? And I'm sitting there going, well, because a couple things. First of all, they might not fully realize AI is helping them buy their groceries, and may not care because that may not be that important to them. But also, I think there was another factor that decision makers have in their head, not for this, I'm gonna pull up a later question because I think it's really related to this topic, which is decision makers, policy makers, they have to think a little beyond that moment, right? And in many cases, they're politicians. They have to think about how to communicate. So they have to use information not only to make decisions in high stress, high stakes scenarios, such as a crisis with a nuclear armed adversary, which sounds pretty high stakes and high stress to me, but they actually need to know they're going to have to walk out and explain and justify those decisions publicly. So if the data is coming out of the black box, or it's in things you don't trust, or something you can't reveal publicly, or a host of other things, that influences the value they put on the information because they may not be able to use it when they go to communicate. What do you think about that?
I think that part is very important, that they need not only faith in themselves, but they're going to have to explain this. Even in the dictatorships, the problem is maybe not as severe and probably different in some ways, but not entirely so. And in any democracy, very severe. Unless they screw up and they're all dead, they are going to have to say, why, what information did you rely on? They're going to face their Benghazi hearings and to say, well, the algorithm told me, or some sensor that I don't understand, that isn't going to do. They need to have, so to speak, a comfort level and the thinking that they can convince others of this. And I think you're right, the people who work on the technology, who have also, I think, greater faith in it, especially if they've designed it, that's not their job. So you need this other layer, and I think it comes up not only, but I think particularly, say, in cyber, where Peter knows this much better than I, but my sense is now the attribution problem, not trivial, but really usually it also can be solved, but may take time, and because you're often relying on very sensitive and secret sources to say, we know who did it. The leader has to say, well, That's great, I know it, but I can't even tell, hard enough to tell a congressional committee, certainly can't tell all Congress, because that means telling everyone. So I need to act on information that I can explain, and that's very hard.
Yeah. Yeah, please.
I want to jump in on this. You use the phrasing, and it's one from the field, of the black box problem, particularly of AI, and it's sometimes also called the explainability problem. And for the most part in the sciences field, it's been around the idea of this is a technology that inherently we can't explain why it comes to that kind of conclusion, and in turn, it can't explain why it came to that conclusion. That is the very kind of value of it, is that it works in ways that humans can't. Otherwise, you could just have humans do it for you. But there's a second kind of black box problem or explainability problem, and this is what we're wrestling with the next book. Is it's the idea of, it's, put it bluntly, it's what those people were saying to you. It's a technology that people don't even know the basics of. They use it every day, or every day it shapes their world around them, and yet they're not familiar with the basic terms, or they think it's something that's so far off in the future that it's science fiction when it's real. To give you kind of real examples of this, the Secretary of the Treasury said AI is not an issue to care about today. It's something not, quote, not on his radar screen, and not an issue for, quote, 50 to 100 years. It's playing out all around us. Or the terming of key issues to the question of psychology. One of the crucial issues of using AI effectively or not is understanding algorithmic bias. That if it has bad data, or if it's trained in a different environment, it might give you perfect conclusions that are designed for one world that aren't great for another. So you train the robotic car on a racetrack, and then you put it in an area with a bunch of human pedestrians. It's not going to go well. Or it's something predictive. To give a real example, you're training it on medical data to help you diagnose heart disease, but there's not enough African Americans in the data set. It's going to give you racially biased data, even though you didn't want it to be. Military version of this, we're currently training the Pentagon AI off of fire orders. So when you use artillery or not, airstrikes or not, from Afghanistan, which is a counterinsurgency environment, but we might be using that AI later in a different kind of environment. So we've got those kind of issues of kind of the bias of it. But another part of it is our inability to just point blank visualize it. And this is where science fiction and real world come crashing together. When we think AI, robotics, nuclear weapons, the only narrative we have is the AI wakes up, comes to life, and kills all of us, right? It's war games, Terminator, or the like. We don't have enough narrative around how are we going to use AI in the real world. So the policymakers default to the very wrong narrative.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah, please. I hadn't really thought about it, but you're right. Like, there's almost this hurdle to overcome in terms of this kind of science fiction-y angst, and that's kind of there. Yeah.
And we know, all the data tells us two things. One, horrible for people who work in academia, but that pop culture and fiction research shows has a greater effect on policymaker decision-making than even the canons of international relations theory. And the second is that we know that it has been responsible for some of the most important policy decisions, even in this space, whether it is the very first, to use your Cold War examples, the very first US cybersecurity policy came out of Reagan watching war games. Yeah. And in turn, you don't get SDI without the movie Star Wars, which I'd use the War Games one as a good example of policy impact. The Star Wars SDI one is a wasted one.
It's interesting. All right, please jump in. I know.
Just a couple of very interesting on AI. When it works well and is really seamless, you don't notice it and you don't attribute it. Your point. It's so, and I do think that decision makers will have real hesitancy. Two other things. One is that by definition, a crisis is unexpected and has. When you get it, it means a lot of your assumptions, you realize, oh my God, that simply was wrong. Go back to Cuban Missile Crisis. Most people had assumptions what Khrushchev would or wouldn't do. Kennedy wakes up and finds he's in a different world. And that's psychologically quite destabilizing because, I built everything on this one assumption. Okay, that's not right. So I have to do two things. First, I have to sort of rebuild with the new foundations. And I got to ask, well, if I was wrong about that, what else could I be wrong with? And you people, the advisors who are around the table, you were wrong too. So why should I, why should I accept what you're telling me? And the other, and related to your point about the interaction between the technology and the policy people, is as, again, you know better than I, and in the government, of course, it isn't two groups, but it's, this enormous organization and multiple layers, and the information filtering that has to go on. I mean, or else that's the whole point of the information, but it means that each level, it can be the game of telephone, and the higher you go, most cases, the less real knowledge of exactly, what is the underlying, is going to be there. And that's hard enough to handle in routine situations, but in a crisis, it's particularly hard. And I don't think we, the academics who do study organizations, are a lot, but still have enough sense of how this works, especially when you have the people from different worlds in a case where the people at the top can't quite say, okay, I don't understand exactly what you're saying, but I get the bottom line and I'm happy to accept that. If they're not in that, they're in very uncharted territory.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Well, I want to talk a little bit about what we kind of call this sort of combined ecosystem, this where sort of nuclear and conventional kind of coming together a bit. Because it means that kind of you have a lot of things operating in this kind of common space. And I think when you see that together with the rapid pace of technological development and kind of the widespread adoption of these capabilities, one of the things we've identified as something that we just need to think through better is that, in the old ecosystem, in the nuclear ecosystem, all of the early warning systems were passive. They were at a distance. They were largely out of striking distance. They were also really reactive. It didn't tell you, there's going to be a nuclear attack. It didn't give you any really sort of predictive warning, right? It just basically said, we can see, there's an ICBM, you've got X amount of time. So you can only really react, right? But it is possible, using the tools that are sort of came out of advanced precision conventional warfare and other tools, combined with things like AI and other advanced sensor capabilities, you might actually develop tools that become a bit more predictive, that might anticipate or create more kind of preemptive opportunity. On the conventional side, I think mostly we would say yay. If it's between a conventional war, we're like, okay, that's good. That's a good way to actually terminate a war more quickly, with fewer negative consequences normally. But kind of when you put it under that nuclear shadow, that could look pretty different. So I was actually wondering if you'd both comment on that a little bit, kind of in both from a technology and a theoretical perspective. I don't know, Peter, you want to go first?
You want to start?
Well, one thing I was struck by in the report, and this lashes up to it, is it seemed there was, you made this division between kind of conventional scenario and a nuclear adversary, and that there was reticence among the participants in the war games to engage in, for example, a higher level of cyber activity, to penetrating an adversary network to learn information about them. And I was struck by that because it was as if no one had told them what the current cyber command strategy is pre-crisis, which is called defend forward, which is a really nice way of saying, I want to already be in those adversary networks. So they were describing it as, I worry about this thing being escalatory if we do it, as if it was an if instead of something, sorry, we're already doing that. That's part of our doctrine right now. And oh, by the way, it's part of the adversary's doctrine. And so one, it's kind of a disconnect of perception to not the technical reality, but the policy reality. Two, it points to how there are certain modes of attack where the attack might take place days, weeks, months before the actual point of crisis. And then third, it brings up again, you mentioned the sort of predictive element of it, the need for policymakers to understand sort of the nature of the prediction. Because one of the things that, and we can see this in, I'll use non-crisis examples, or maybe for some people a crisis. You could see this in everything from the 2016 election to the Super Bowl, where there were people stunned by, we would get these numeric predictions of it's a 70% chance that Hillary Clinton is going to win, or it is the Super Bowl, at one point in the game, it was a 93% chance that the 49ers were gonna win. And people sort of cling to your cling to that. Oh, that means it's gonna happen. No, it means at this point in time, running all of these scenarios, here's the curve of it, but they cling and think it's certainty, and they're not well trained to deal with some of the predictions that the AI is giving you. Not only that it might be biased, but the form of it is very different than saying you ought to do X.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Did you have another thought on that?
A couple of, I think, again, our brains, we have an intuitive sense of probabilities, but we don't like them. I mean, right? We really crave certainty. And it's, again, on the election, I have this, my wife keeps reminding me that I said that, Hillary was very likely to win. I put the odds following, about 2-1. And, so she keeps reminding me that I was wrong. No, I may not have been wrong, right? We simply don't know in that thing. If you say the odds are 2-1, that means one time out of 3 out of the randomness, a lot of randomness, the way people vote, it's going to come out the other way. And people, are very, especially in a crisis, very uncomfortable with saying, what? You're giving me odds? Really? Either the other side is going to attack or he isn't, and you're giving me odds. That really, for a lot of people, doesn't make a tremendous amount of sense. And I think another complication you mentioned, I just want to stress my sense for it. I don't live in this strange world. I'm in New York where there are nothing but billionaires, but running for president. But my sense is that the people at the top don't understand what Cyber Command is doing. That is the degree to which, as you said, we're on a lot of people's networks and doing, a lot of things. And this administration, especially, as you know, delegated more stuff to Cyber Command than the Obama group did. And I think, right, that they don't understand that, and they probably don't understand also fully how much others are in our networks. If you come to a crisis, and then the president is briefed on, what penetrations there are in our systems, those will look much more frightening because they look new. And furthermore, I think, again, especially in a crisis, people tend to use the double standard. Oh, we may be doing stuff defensively. We're putting our sensors forward, or we're trying to even do some drone overflights because we can't afford to be taken by surprise, but it doesn't mean we're going to do anything aggressive. It's purely protective. You also assume, well, the other side, knows that. Well, the other side does something like that. The inference you make is very, very different. The only reason they would be doing that is to prepare for an attack. So you can see that quite quickly spiraling, and this is especially true when you think of the cyber, because as we know, unfortunately, cyber espionage and cyber attack, everything's the same except for the payload. At the end, you can't discriminate between them until it's too late. And Ben Buchanan has a very good book on the cybersecurity dilemma that stresses that, I think, and that gets heightened, especially when you don't have time to decompress and say, well, wait a minute, let's look at it another way.
Yeah. Well, just on that, I would say a couple things just to respond a little bit on, especially on the cyber point. So I think you're right. It's very possible that, senior officials in government today are much more knowledgeable about the details of what, kind of cyber command defend forward really looks like. And probably good that the rest of us don't have a whole lot of detailed knowledge about that. But I do think the participants tapped into something that's really important and that actually isn't new. What they were searching for was to understand what's baseline and what's new. Like on the nuclear side, we think of that as like what constitutes a generation of forces, right? If you are ready all the time, our ICBMs are ready all the time, right? Like those are constantly generated. They could, the order could be given at a moment. You don't have to like get them going like we would with our bombers, for example. So this group, which tended to be people who are interested in nuclear issues, would quickly look at cyber and say, well, what's baseline? What are things that the adversary might have kind of baked into their understanding of normal, right? Do they even know what normal is? Because do they know? Like generating our bombers or not, they're going to kind of know, right? So on the nuclear side, it's kind of declared. So do they know what baseline is? But what they would tune into was two things. One, what constitutes a delta? What's different? If you do something different, where they immediately went with that was there must be a signal or a message associated with that. And they would want to anticipate that and in many cases try to control that. One example would be a case where there was actually would it be possible to send something in cyber or activate a 0-day, but instead of it being secretive, actually make it overt? And I had more than one group raise this as a possibility because they are thinking not just in terms of how do I accomplish the task, but how do I message with the task? So that was a really interesting, so some of it's IQ, but some of it is crossing between these theoretical principles, I think.
But you've got to know, of course, what's very hard to know. How's the other side going to get this and pick it up again? Any of you read my books know the plural of anecdote is data. I love anecdotes. And in the fall of 1969, when Nixon decided he couldn't do something big in Vietnam because it was too risky and the domestic politics wouldn't allow it, he and Kissinger decided on the nuclear alert to show most of the Soviet Union this was dangerous. Nixon and Kissinger meant what they said when they said we have to end the war this year or else, and Kissinger conveyed this to Britain. Anyway, long story short, so they put SAC on alert, and the instructions specifically were to do things that, the Soviets would pick up. They didn't. The alert lasted a month. 3 weeks, the Soviets didn't pick up anything. I mean, this stuff was pretty obvious. They got nothing, bupkis. And then the last week, they finally noticed something and attributed it to American reaction to Sino-Soviet skirmishes in the summer. I write about signaling a lot, and there's some very fancy game theory academic work, which is marvelous, no relation to reality, but great fun. But, you know, if you send a signal in the forest and no one hears it, you ain't done it. But you're not apt to know that either, and you're apt to interpret what the other is doing, thinking, aha, he's picked that up and this we're doing in response, when that's often not the case.
To build on this with examples from the space, that the signals, even when they happen, it's hard sometimes to figure out the intent or if it was meant as a signal. So to give a real world example, a few years back, there was Russian cyber activity inside US banks. And the questions that then surfaced were everything from, oh, is this in retaliation for certain financial sanctions that we had done? So it's a tit for tat.
Yeah.
But did they mean to get caught or not?
Yeah.
Right.
So was it they were actually trying to carry out an attack and failed? Or did they do it loud in a manner so that they would be caught and they wanted us there? A different example play on this maybe is that you can read signals where they are not, or where context matters. So your Iran scenario, 2 years ago, roughly about 2 years ago, the city of Atlanta effectively shuts down its city government because of a ransomware attack. It's later traced back to Iran, but not the Iranian government. It's basically kind of criminal activity. But that's just when it kicked in. If that very same thing had happened a couple months ago within the context of everything was playing out with Iran, Atlanta city government is locked up, shut down. We would have gone, oh, Iran's escalating greatly. They're signaling, when it's just the way that the software was playing out at that point in time. So it's really difficult to read all this. And I go back to most policymakers, I don't think, have the nuance or facility with this space right now to kind of read or understand these signals, and sometimes the uncertainty around it.
Yeah. Some of them sound pretty hard to ever figure out.
Yeah.
But yeah, I agree the
Exactly,
IQ level might help us at least winnow down the problem space. But so like similar to this issue of anecdote, but also analogy. I flagged, in perceptions and misperceptions, I got a couple quotes, and because some of them seemed so apropos. By making accessible insights derived from previous events, analogies provide a useful shortcut to rationality, but they also obscure aspects of the present case that are different from the past one. I was really taken with this because one of the things I've kind of captured in my takeaway from the experience of the tabletops was the number of times when anything, wasn't even just related to the flight of manned aircraft as a collection tool, it also related to any air asset of any kind, a hail UAV, even certain types of space-based, but anything that was accessible or potentially seeable by the adversary, almost without fail, especially among groups that might have some memory of this, they brought up the 1960 shoot down of Gary Powers.
Yes.
And I thought, this is so interesting. Really? Like, this is what's in your mind, is something that was 60. I understand, it's relevant, but like, aren't there 1,000 other analogies to draw from? But that's where they went repeatedly. So think how I was just like, how do I get past that? A 60-year-old analogy.
Yes, and that's even, because quite often the analogies people seize on were events that occurred when they were in a formative period, either in their, just when they were becoming aware of politics, or if they were in the government, something that then happened that they had some personal role in. So it's really interesting there that most of your people there were not presumably my age in remembering it at the time, because I can remember at the time, but going back to others, people really, they need something to latch onto. You need a framework, and here you need it quickly. And it almost, it occurs not in the deep sense of Freudian unconscious, but it is still occurs at the level below consciousness. And once you have it, it's very hard to say, yeah, that was really interesting and important there, but, very much different time, different place. One antidote, although it is hard, is in a group, if someone does that, if others can quickly think, wait a minute, let me try 3 or 4 others. And then let's think about, not dismiss them all, but think what we get from all of them, or is that really the right one? But when there are things that people have in common, and especially I could imagine within an organization, I would say within military, the U2 would be highly salient. So any organization, any of these memories that are shared are particularly dangerous, especially as you point out here that the point your reports make that you mentioned, but I just want to stress because it's new to me, and Peter may want to also say a little more about it, is the sort of potential interaction of the sensors themselves, that our sensors in a way interacting, or their sensor picking up activity of our sensor, and in a way that is quite different from anything we've seen, and in which, in my one of the IR analogies, and comparables held in the public just as well, World War I, which to some extent the immediate trigger was the belief the other side was going to strike first in the mobilization races. And there, some of it really was what the people reported about the mobilization posters going up on the streets. So you had these views of the other, but the person reporting from Paris didn't interact in any way with the person reporting from Moscow. The two. Now, if our sensors are in effect picking up each other, it's hard to find analogies for that.
Well, I think you brought up a really good point about the importance of having a range of expertise in the room, so you have other people who might draw from other analogies and then let them interact a little bit. I do think it's possible. The nuclear community, has a lore, right?
Yes.
It has a kind of a book. And orthodoxy, and some of these historical analogies are very prominent in there, and I think that's one of the reasons why someone didn't just have to experience it personally in order to raise it. But yeah, I think that kind of played out. I mean, Peter, I'd love for you to chime in on this point or what Robert just said earlier, if you have a thought.
Gosh, the first is we know in any situation, having people with diverse viewpoints, backgrounds, perspectives, educations is going to lead to better decision outcomes. And we also know that the policymaking space tends to not have that. So you've got that first aspect of it. A second, a challenge, I think, that's maybe thrown into this by the new types of technology is the capabilities sometimes are exponentially different. So if you were thinking about everything from there is this new Soviet missile that does X, it will have a sort of, it once went 2,000 kilometers and the new one, oh my gosh, a game changer, it goes 2,400 kilometers. To the flip side, the prediction of the kind of damage that capability might be able to pull off. I drop this bomb, I know it will hit this blast radius. Versus in this space, if you're looking at something like whether it's a sensor that's collecting or it's a new piece of malware that's going after a command and control network, it's going to be very difficult to predict. Its capability might be 10, 15 times better. Maybe it's 1,000 times better, which we're not able to kind of wrap our heads around. Its damage, one of the challenges of the misperceptions around cyber warfare is that it's highly precise. Yes, it is, but actually it's not simultaneously. It can get out, it can hit other targets unintentionally. Stuxnet is a great example of that, where yes, it was highly precise and tailored, but it also popped up into 25,000 other computers around the world. I don't think when the president was briefed that he was told that was also going to happen. So you've got that aspect of it, and then finally you have the interactivity thing that you bring up. I've got my AI, I've got my decision systems, you've got yours. It's going to be really hard to game out what happens when they come crashing together, because everything, all your interests are keeping your system secret and its capabilities from me. So how, in the point of crisis, these things come together, you're not going to be able to do track twos around them. You're not going to be able to say, you give me your AI battle management system, and I'll do mine, and we'll have a CSIS Xinhua Center track two, and we'll all let it game out. It's not going to happen that way.
Yeah. That's a really good point. A little scary, but really good. I want to be able to open it up to questions in just a minute, so I kind of want to raise one more issue with you, and then I'll see if I can sneak in a few more of my questions. But as I was preparing for the event, I found it interesting that both of you in your writing in different places talked about the impact of cognitive biases in how people process information and the implications it could have for managing and responding to crisis. This is something we talk about quite a bit in the report. We think it's really important. And I would just highlight, I think we think it's important because A, it has more kind of risk, potential crisis management or escalatory risk than I think is appreciated. But also, it seems to be an area where actually we might be able to work on training, education, IQ, awareness raising. You've already mentioned an example. Make sure you have enough competing viewpoints in the room that you can bring other analogies in. There is actual work being done in the business community about debiasing decision making to make it more effective, to reduce some of those risks. So I think our conclusion was, wow, all right, A, this is more of a risk, but you know what, it's also something we kind of have the potential to influence. Like, I can only influence the way an adversary is going to perceive something so much, right? But some of these questions, in terms of the negative impact of bias in senior decision making, like, we can work on that, And so I really wanted to ask you both about that a little bit, because you both have really mentioned it. And maybe Peter, I'll ask you to go first, and then wind up with you.
Sure. So if you think about the impact of some of these areas, we've touched on one, which is like the bias nature of it. But as you were saying this, I was thinking we will see effect on leader behavior, leader selection, and pressures on leaders. So one example of leader behavior, kind of cognitive issue we're going to have to run into, and we already see this in the tactical military environment, is all of this situational awareness and communication tools that allow you to reach out to the edge is leading to massive amounts of micromanagement, where the most senior leader can reach down at the most tactical level and weigh in on what ought to happen. So the Cuban Missile Crisis example, Kennedy could not see what the U-2 was as it was flying, could not take over the operation of the Navy ship in the midst of the blockade, and yet you can do that now. And we have case examples from, for example, Afghanistan, where leaders are reaching down in the midst of battle, and to use one anecdote, literally trying to move individual soldiers, not even units. Soldier, you go hide behind that tree. And it's like crack for leaders, because you're the leader. You're there because you're the smartest and the best. Why should you not reach down, even though you are not trained for that task? Second, leader selection. For democracies, we have the very first commander-in-chief to have used social media before he became commander-in-chief. He didn't join until he was 61 years old. And we can predict moving forward that we will see more of these leaders who grew up in a world of social media, influenced by it, maybe in part selected by it. So, to put it bluntly, It's a space that rewards a certain kind of personality, antagonistic, etc. So what are the democratic leaders who's being elected in the future different than maybe the pathways to power in the past? And then finally, the leader pressure, even for authoritarian states. We see, for example, in China, where it's an authoritarian leadership that's not selected via social media, but it's incredibly worried about social media trends. It's both stoked huge amounts of nationalism, steers anger at certain things, but the worry is in a point of crisis, can it kind of turn that anger off, or does it feel pressured to act? And to use your World War I parallel, it's to go back and you read the diaries of both the advisors to the German Kaiser and the Tsar. They talked about not needing to go to war to win the war, but needing to go to war because if they didn't, and this is what's so ironic about it, that the ruler would lose his crown. They felt popular pressure to go to war, even though they were not democracies.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I want to kind of pull this thread a little bit because I actually had a quote from you on this subject and kind of where's the trend of this cognitive bias going? Because you said in Like War, you said, put simply, people like to be right. They hate to be proven wrong. In the 1960s, an English psychologist isolated this phenomenon and put a name on it, confirmation bias, which is kind of the core. And we definitely feel like we observed a lot of confirmation bias playing out in some of these structures. And then you said, what the internet does is throw this process into overdrive, fueling the brain's worst impulses and then spreading them to countless others. I mean, that is really what it is, right? Like, it takes confirmation bias and just like dials it up. And I thought that was really interesting. So how do you think that kind of plays out from this kind of bias problem? And I'll circle back, but Peter, just on that point.
I think it goes back to who is more likely to be selected as leaders. They are people that, look, Trump's own political advisors describe the rules of Trump, and among them is never apologize, no matter what, you're never wrong. Another one is every argument is a good thing. And so move that into a space where not just Trump, but it's kind of the cohort of what follows. You have confrontations, people who see confrontations as a good thing, who see them in hyper-personal manners because it's happening in front of the world, and it also might make it harder to back down. And then how do they ingest new information? Well, if you're never wrong and you never apologize, then all information has to kind of go through that space. So it's a worry about it. And again, but I think we might see similar factors hitting authoritarian states where they are equally having to navigate the pressures of their broader, they're turning to stoking nationalism as a way of maintaining power. But in crisis, nationalism steers you down certain pathways of behavior.
Yeah. Well, I just think it's interesting because definitely I think that the virality of things on social media is very much connected to this confirmation bias. It helps to really fuel it because that's kind of what gets re-forwarded. But what do you think, Dr. Jervis?
Let me take off on especially the confidence. I mean, any leader will only have risen to that position if he or she had been proven right an awful lot over the career, especially in cases when others said, no, that won't work, you can't do that. It may actually be just luck of the draw, that luck has gotten the person to the top, but that's not the way the person's going to interpret it. And also related, to act in these situations that really are life and death for the societies requires a tremendous amount of confidence, and there's a real clash between that and often the information processing in the government, and especially when I've looked at the role of intelligence, but more broadly, because often the experts say, no, maybe, that's probably right, but let me tell you 3 things why that isn't, and that sensor has malfunctioned in the past. And there's this real conflict came up very nicely, a discussion in the Kennedy administration between former Secretary of State Acheson and a famous political scientist and presidential advisor, Richard Neustadt. Marvelous book, Presidential Power, about this. And Dick had worked in the Truman administration. And he stressed alternative streams and, making the president more thoughtful. And Acheson cornered Neustadt at a cocktail party and said, Dick, the problem, you're trying to, bring the president all this conflicting advice. My job is to get the president to make a decision. And there's a conflict here. And so I think leaders often do embrace confirmation bias, which exists in all of us and in multiple manifestations. And it makes it hard to shake them. And another aspect that leads another kind of bias known as a motivated or more affective or emotional bias that can be very important, especially in crises, is people don't like to acknowledge painful value trade-offs. Presidents and leaders always talk about, I make hard decisions. Bring the hard decisions to me. No one likes hard decisions. By definition, a hard decision means either, oh my God, I could end up being really wrong, or even if I'm right, I'm sacrificing a lot of some values to get another. Those are terrible things to think about. And if you're going to be an effective leader, if you dwell on that, you really can't. So that leaders tend to think, they make a decision, that the decision is best for multiple values they're trying to serve. And this is particularly relevant in the crisis, because since there are really two broad objectives, one is to get out of this without fighting, and the other is, if it fights, to be able to have the advantage or to minimize the destructiveness to your society. Unfortunately, the two often conflict. Let me give one example at a lower level, but it works very nice in the warning system, and again related to biasing. This is the Vincennes, the cruiser in the Persian Gulf at the end of the Iran-Iraq war. And the captain was very aggressive. He trained the crew to be hyper alert to possible attacks, which really were, I think, fairly unlikely, although there had been some more from Iraq than Iran. And an Iranian airliner took off, it's following its normal flight path, but a combination of the fact that he trained the crew to be hyper alert, and there was a technical change that the people manning the radar scopes didn't know that changed the symbol assigned to planes at a certain point, but the radar didn't know it. The radar operators misread it. They shot the plane down. It was a civilian airliner. The Iranians, that's an historical analogy, they have very much in their minds. We don't have it all. They have a terrible thing. The irony is it led Khomeini to decide the U.S. was about to enter the war, and that he therefore had to do what he didn't want to do, which was end it even without overthrowing Saddam. But really the point, not the happy ending through the irony, but the training and the people on the ship, didn't carefully manage the trade-off, and partly because they'd been trained to be hyper alert. So the training really matters, can do you good in some circumstances, but get you in real trouble.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'll just highlight and bring it in the conversation, because I'm going to go around. Please get your questions ready. I'm coming to you. Because one of the things that we really observed, and I think your idea of how does a decision maker kind of address as many values as possible, right? That's interesting. Hadn't really thought of that, but I think it relates to something we very much observed, which is that group after group, senior groups, junior groups, whatever, for the most part, were very, very, very concerned about escalation. We started the project saying, gee, maybe, participants won't be sufficiently concerned about using things they're absolutely, used to seeing in the conventional space and kind of stumble into escalation. And frankly, that was a naive, kind of theoretical idea on our part. We didn't really see that, right?
Yeah.
What we saw was highly attuned, whether they were a junior participant or a senior participant, highly attuned and anxious about escalation, intending to put de-escalating the crisis way up. And that led to the other things that would then happen, such as the micromanagement of assets or the extremely conservative posture and this kind of dynamic of escalation anxiety that we observe. And again, that could be really good, right?
Yeah.
You're in a crisis, we want decision makers to be really attuned to escalation risks. There were a few times where it almost felt like it went so far that it would be like, okay, we didn't escalate, but we're just about to really lose this
Yes.
war. So there's a really difficult trade-off there. And I wonder what it would be like, if I were going ahead doing this more, I'd be interested in getting some groups together that are a little less nuclear in their background and a little more like conventional, and see if they would do different things, have different sensitivities. But that anxiety was very prevalent in every group. Feel free to circle in on that, but I do want to bring people in who have some questions. We have one right here in the front, so we'll take this one first. And then I'll go out to the far side with the other one. Let's start here. Please introduce yourself, your affiliation, and just a brief question, if you would.
Yes, thank you. My name is Sina Azori. I'm a PhD candidate. I'm doing IR. A quick question. You mentioned the developments of new technologies, or evolution rather. How do you think they impacted the concept of deterrence as we know it? I mean, especially with UAVs. Do they change deterrence? Do they have any impact on the concept? Thank you.
Okay, good. Do you mind if we take a couple questions and then, all right, so we'll do like two at a time. There was one over here.
Dan Roper, Association of the United States Army. In a similar vein to that first question, I was going to ask about, with the dissolution of the INF Treaty and the introduction of long-range fires from both the US side, the Russian and Chinese side, with those advancements plus the advances in hypersonics, how does that affect the decision calculus of friends, foes, and potential partners?
All right, so interesting. Both questions kind of related to the intersection of technology and deterrence in a crisis. So, you want to go first?
Just one or two things. That my understanding, considering of the hypersonics, is it's quite troublesome for what we've been talking about, which is the warning systems, that it isn't their speed or anything, but that on the one hand, certainly for the intercontinental, we can't do the dual factor authentication that we can do with ICBMs. So that really raises, can we get another kind of sensor so that we really will have two? If we can't, we have to think more about what do we do on the basis of information that by its nature is not as reliable as what we thought we were getting in the good old days of ballistic missiles. Each of those is hard, and of course also because they're maneuverable, you can't predict, the target. Are they going for military bases, bad, but something we're attuned to, or is it a decapitation, or what's the interpretation, and you just won't know. So I think it in that way really complicates the matters. I'm not sure the INF, I regret that we pulled out of the treaty. I think it was a difficult situation. The Russians were clearly breaking it. I think there were other things we might have done, but anyway, leaving that aside, I'm not sure that it makes most of the problems we're dealing with here much harder. It introduces another level of sort of weapons you have to worry about, but I don't think it's an order of magnitude change.
Thank you, Peter.
On the deterrence question, I don't know if it changes in terms of kind of deterrence concept itself, because at the end of the day, deterrence is not about technology, it's about psychology. It's about the actor's decision on whether today is a good day to go to war or not. It's sort of the basic part of it. I do think, though, it does reshape which sort of concepts in terms of our doctrine of deterrence or our approach to it. So to give an example, to go back to that asymmetry, we've, from the nuclear era, thought about deterrence in terms of deterrence by punishment or retaliation, or however you want to frame it, which basically comes down to, you don't hit me because I'm going to hit you back. That works with nukes, that may not be as viable in a world of asymmetry where, North Korea may not be deterred from cyber attacking me because I'll cyber attack it back. They go, that's fine, I'll take that trade-off because I can hit you harder. We already see that challenge of thinking of the world of kind of like versus like punishment vis-a-vis Russia in information warfare. There may be other approaches that were non-viable during the Cold War with nuclear weapons that might make sense in this space. So, for example, the concept of deterrence by denial, where you don't hit me because I'm resilient against it. Your attacks will not work. That is why, for example, Estonia has better cyber deterrence than the United States, even though it doesn't have, I would argue, even though it doesn't have the same kind of offensive capability. It's because it's better able to resist attack on it. It's better able to shake it off. This is the Taylor Swift strategy of deterrence. There's also, you mentioned robotics. It may affect how you think about the value of certain weapon systems. So robotics, one of the attributes of them is they're highly disposable. I don't care. I avoid the Gary Powers incident, whether it's in my surveillance side because I'm sending unmanned aerial systems and I don't care if they get shot down. We've already established a precedent. I don't think he intended to, but Trump did, that you can now shoot down our stuff, and you know what? As long as it's unmanned, we're not going to retaliate in the same way. Maybe that's good, maybe it's not, but that's there. Or it may be your literal weapon systems, where I flood the zone in a way with unmanned systems. Go ahead, shoot down 99% of them. That's great. I don't care because I fired 100 at you because they're cheap and disposable. Similar to, you mentioned sensors in space. How we think about, do I want small numbers of big capable spy satellites, or do I want large numbers of cheap disposable ones?
Let me just two quick things. One is, the point about resilience I think is very important in the cyber. As I understand it, there's more and more thinking of that's not the only way to go, but really very important. And a lot of the, I think, loose thinking in the media is, they can, quote, take down the power grid. Well, probably you can't, and take it down for how long, what do you do? But to be able to recover quickly can really, in many of these things, not be all the answer, but very important. The other is on deterrence. There is thinking, although I don't think any of us have made great strides on, called cross-domain deterrence, space, cyber, conventional. If you remember Michael Nacht at the lab, he started that when he was in the Pentagon. I was in a panel that we tried. Very hard there. In the Cold War, we developed certain implicit rules of the game. We don't have that on, if it's true that Trump retaliated for the knocking down of the drone with a cyber attack, it's a story in the paper, are you true? Quite plausible. Well, how do we work that? Are we going to think about using both deterrence and more offensive coercion by shifting these domains, that the greater range of technologies really opens up the possibilities and may complicate our ways of thinking about it.
Yeah, good point. I know I have two in the front. Oh yeah, more and more hands. Okay, so right here, please. Or actually, okay. Well, then the next one here. Go ahead.
Hi, Luke Radis, NTI. I was wondering if you could say a few words about how the high level of deniability inherent to cyber technologies can affect the SA ecosystem.
Okay, thank you. Let's get this Bob right here. Thank you.
Hi, Bob Peters from the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. Just a comment, Rebecca, I think your point was spot on about this kind of self-deterrence in a lot of the players, and that they're so concerned about escalation control that they're sometimes in danger of losing the war. I think the dual capable weapon systems and platforms problem has only made that more so. And just from what I've observed, when blue players look at, oh, red they've got dual capable cruise missiles and ballistic missiles, surface-to-air missiles, it makes them even more reticent. I think I am starting to see a shift in the opposite direction now, though, and you're seeing more and more players starting to say, well, you know what, they brought this on themselves, and I'm going to strike that target. If I get a sympathetic detonation, then so be it. It's really Red's fault for doing this.
Since that was a comment, let's take this one more question over here.
Thank you. My name is Sang Min. I'm a reporter from the Radio Free Asia. I have a question, Dr. Jarvis, regarding the North Korea issue. So you mentioned before that there was a first summit between President Trump and Kim Jong-un in 2018. You mentioned that the summit can be leaded to crisis, to lead to war, because of there is a misperception between two leaders. So President Kim thinks that Chairman Kim that United States may accept North Korea as a nuclear state, and then the President Kim may think that Kim Jong-un is going to give up nuclear weapon. But as of now, we have 3 times there is a summit, and how to assess the 3 times summit between President Trump and then Kim Jong-un, and how to assess the current situation between United States and North Korea.
I'm going to try to help neck that in. So is really the question of, how do you think deterrence played out in a series of exchanges between President Trump and Chairman Kim? Is that the gist of the question?
Yes, that's what part of the mentioned that summit cannot be needed to the crisis because of there is a misperception between two leaders. Therefore, he mentioned like this. Therefore, but we have 3 times the summit between two leaders, but there is no any crisis, no war. So therefore, how to assess the 3 summit based on his assessment before, and then based on how to assess current situation between United States and North Korea.
All right. So some commentary on how they've met 3 times and how would that impact their ability to perceive each other more accurately, less accurately, and so forth. I might take one more right back in the center here.
Hi, Jessica Bland, British Embassy. My question kind of revolves a little bit more around your comments on how we rely on old analogies and confirmation bias, and a little bit around, you talked towards improving IQ of leaders and how that might naturally come about in future generations or future iterations. What can people in government do now to take the time with their leaders to get their IQ up to a speed so that they can make decisions in a rapid environment?
Thank you. All right. I think there's some good items there. Peter, do you want to go first?
Sure, I'll hook off the last one. I do think we need to, much like we would in any other realm, try and use as many different tools as possible to help us grapple with these new questions, new technologies, et cetera. And that might be through traditional modes that we're all comfortable with, briefing notes, white papers, et cetera. But it also, we're seeing, it might be, they're kind of traditional, but they have new versions of them, crisis simulation, war games. They don't always have to be day-long versions. There's digital visualizations of them, et cetera. There's different ways of trying to drop people into that world. Doesn't apply as much for the leaders, but the mid-tier, they're sometimes called boot camps. They've got this in cyber, for example, where it's professional development exercises to give them a familiarity with a certain new area. So there's versions of this for congressional staffers going and getting a week's worth of training on cyber, much like we did back in the day on nuclear issues. There's finally something that I've played with. This goes by different terms, but it's basically the data shows that synthetic environments are among the most influential on people, dropping them into the world and having them believe, kind of look at it through the point of view of players in that world. And then the second is, frankly, they're more likely to read them than dry tomes. And so that's what we've tried to do with, for example, the Ghost Fleet and the Burn-In project. And I think there's a lot more that can be done in that space. And I know you mentioned the UK. I know it's, for example, explored that through graphic novellas, trying to explain disinformation warfare. So there's lots of different tools that I think we can use. The only other, I'll take one of the other questions or statements in the issue of deniability that you ask about. I think the real challenge is trying to figure out, and it goes back to the sense of confidence, what court, so to speak, do we care most about? Is it a court of law, an international law or whatever exercise where we need to have beyond a reasonable doubt that this is the actor that hit me? Is that who I'm making the case to? Is it a court of public opinion where actually it may not be the number, the 99% number that matters most? It may be that anecdote that carries the day with the court of public opinion. Or is it just the court of the National Security Council or the president's own mind, where maybe it's a 51% call for them? Which do we care most about? But I think what's interesting is that it goes back to the threats to these is that we now have examples of things where we were beyond a reasonable doubt, and yet there is deep doubt about it. The Russian hack of the DNC, 17 U.S. intelligence agencies, 6 different allied intelligence agencies, 5 different cybersecurity companies, and yet, roughly 1/3 of the American body politic doesn't buy it. We've got as good a case as you're ever going to get, and we don't buy it. So that's where the court that you care about matters, but also we have ways to attack the judgment of that court.
Go ahead.
Yeah, let me just pick a couple of these. Let me just continue a bit on deniability. Another aspect that, of course, deniability, again, is as old as recorded history for the U.S., big part of covert action and the CIA being able to do things that were deniable. Sometimes what you really cared about was really the other side not being sure you'd done it. But in many cases, you want deniability because it's less provocative. You've done something to the other side, but it isn't as much in your face. And so even when the other side can figure out you've done it, if you keep it, if you deny it, and it isn't something that you start giggling about when you deny, and the other side can not totally dispute the denial, that can be a way thinking again of escalation. That's at a lower level than saying, I've done it, I'm poking you in the eye. A little on the North Korea, 2 things. One is that interaction is interesting because we've seen us, and we see it with US and Iran, a series of things, and a question of how you develop both an understanding of the other side and change deterrence, not in a crisis, but in a series of interactions. And we weren't sort of fully as used to that because the deterrence ideas were really developed for one big thing, nuclear war. but looking more at the U.S.-North Korea interaction is interesting, and specifically on the role of the summit meetings. Another thing we know from psychology is that people, especially leaders who are self-confident, extract an enormous amount of information from face-to-face meetings. Trump is not unique in seeking them. FDR felt that he really had to see Stalin because both if he saw Stalin, he could size him up, and he could convince Stalin of his FDR's sincerity and trying to, develop a new world. I think decision makers are wrong on both counts. I mean, we have a lot of data that we know firsthand impressions are very vivid in our minds. They're very strong. We know in job interviews and in industry and in the universities, they are make or break. And we also know they're highly unreliable. You really should not put much credence in them, but leaders clearly do. Sometimes it works well for change, and a lot of changes in relations, the Gorbachev-Reagan connection. This wasn't all there was to it, but it was an important part, but it can be highly misleading, and it's very hard for leaders to shake those impressions. And also not helpful because then leaders have all this information in their head they don't share in the rest of the government. I mean, Trump again is extreme, but others, even reasonable leaders on this score don't tell all the people whose job it is to understand the other side, all the information they've desired. So it's not surprising that on the one hand, leaders crave the face-to-face meetings, and most of the people in the rest of the government really fear them.
Yeah, good point. I want to chime in on one thing, Jessica, on your question about the what can people do, because that is something we're thinking about. One of the things that you can kind of see in the literature, especially coming out of business literature, is that de-bias kind of training, education activities can actually make a significant change in the quality of decision making. I mean, I don't really know how they do this math, but you hear numbers bandied around of 20% improvements, 30% improvements. I don't really know about that, but there is a sense that you can do it, that you can actually kind of help to mitigate that with certain techniques.
Can I break in with a bibliography that a good friend of mine, Phil Tetlock, who has a couple of marvelous books on prediction, worked both with industry and worked with the U.S. intelligence community. Also has written very nuanced works about both the possibilities and limits of the debiasing. Yeah, I think it's very interesting. And there's an awful lot we don't know, and I, partly of course because I'm not in the business, I don't trust some of the stuff being sold in some of the business schools, but it is an area where I think we are learning more.
Yeah. I think it's a tool we can look at, and I think there's two ways to approach it. One is to really encourage kind of challenging, at least the slow down and think part that needs to happen in senior leader decision, crisis simulation, and others. There are really good techniques for slow down and think to kind of help unpack what's driving you to certain decisional outcomes. And there are some things I think we could do there. Some of the other just IQ raising about, and honestly, it's about IQ raising on the policy side about the technology. I think it's also IQ raising on the technology side about the dynamics for policymakers. And then the final one I would just say on that is, there's a role, and we're very conscious of this with Pony, because we have a mission to kind of help look at the next generation, right? And kind of cultivate, nurture that. And one of the things we're going to take away from this project is, how do we incorporate this into the work we do with kind of next gen? Because it's kind of hard to learn a whole lot of new tricks once you're a senior decision maker. But some of these things, such as thinking through about bias, recognizing some of your own vulnerabilities to bias, those are things we can work on when we're a bit kind of younger, coming up in the field. And we can also work on some of that IQ raising as well. So as a mission, we kind of see it there. I am going to have to kind of take it down to the one or two last super quick questions and wrap it up, because we are at the end of our time. I know you have been waiting over here. I know, yeah, I saw Sylvia earlier too. So those are going to be my last two. I apologize for others, but you'll have more time for questions also in the next session. Real quick, if you don't
Hi,
mind.
thank you. I can phrase my question quickly, but I can't speak to the responses. My name is James Siebens. I'm from the Stimson Center. I want to ask for your impressions about the impact of new technologies on offense-defense balance. It seems to me that everything that's coming out and that we're investing in heavily favors the offense, and what are the implications of that?
And Sylvia?
My name is Sylvia Mishra. I'm a PhD student. My question is, to what extent does social media impact the escalation calculus in crisis scenarios? Last year, India-Pakistan was in a standoff for almost 10 days. To what extent does leaders play into the hype that is created by netizens on social media, and does that shorten decision time making for leaders? Thank you.
Thank you. All right, well, two really good questions to wrap up on, so a couple of quick answers.
Peter, you want to start?
So I'll go in inverse. Circling back, I think the impact of social media on crisis, one, it may provide you more information, but sometimes false information can go viral, and we have case examples in Like War, the book of that, where you had belief of threats that had been made by statesmen that had not been made because they're being reported online, to armed troops showing up at a certain area, that the report of the armed troops showing up at the area was false. Second, in democracies, at least so far, we've seen more of a trend fueled by social media of populist, more nationalist leaders, personality-wise also more self-confident, more antagonistic, and viewing everything through a hyper-personal lens, even more so than leaders do. So both they think they can get a deal because it's all about them, not the nation, to the disagreement is a direct affront to me. Third, the pressure points of the populace itself on leaders. I think the crisis that you mentioned between India and Pakistan, but again, we've seen this in South China Sea examples where the population gets whipped up and then gets angry as the crisis begins to get tamped down. Because the very nature of a crisis ending is usually both sides don't get exactly what they want. And so we could see this in China in one of the scenarios where the anger turned. People were posting online, why have you keep telling us how powerful our Navy is, why are we not using it, not being happy that we weren't at war. So I think those are some of the impact points of it. And then the other question, offense, defense, I think you're right. So far it's been more fueling the offense capability, or at least more importantly, related to the World War I parallel, the perceptions of the offense capability. The one thing that might tweak or change that is AI, at least related to cyber warfare. The more data you have, the better. The smarter, better your AI is going to be. And the defenders should be able to share information in a way that attackers can't, because they can operate out in the open. So defenders, hopefully, if they can figure out how to share information, are more likely to have access to greater amounts of data versus the attacker who sort of has to keep what they're doing secret. That's the one thing that I think might pivot it.
Interesting.
Yeah, well, briefly, again, let me start with that offense, defense, since I did an article, was it 30 and 40 years ago, on talking about the importance of the offense, defense balance and distinction, but I did it as a theorist. And all the literature that's followed has tried to operationalize it. I took the easy way out. So it's very hard to see how this actually plays out. So instead of an answer, I'll give a bibliographic reference. I think it's the fall issue of Journal of Strategic Studies is about on the new technology, and several of the articles talk about that. They don't agree, as usual, but it's a good place to start. On the social media more broadly, and the point, and Peter made it earlier on the panopticon, several problems, and maybe they're good sides, but they're harder to find. several analysts have pointed out, even as early as the 1990s, that if the Cuban Missile Crisis happened, you probably couldn't have had a week of secret deliberations. It's interesting in that crisis, the first reaction of Kennedy and everyone else around the table was to use force. Khrushchev's and his colleagues' first reaction, literally the first 24 hours, was screw them. We're not going to let them get away with this. We are, going to stand firm. It took a while and prolonged thinking and, in effect, playing out the next moves for both sides to say, that's just not going to work. And they had pressures, the psychological pressures, and Khrushchev, of course, he was involved. It was known, but the Soviet public wasn't a great pressure. So whether we'll still have that, whether in another crisis, someone standing in Lafayette Square Park would say, hey, there are more cars coming into the White House this week than usual. Something is going on that, and start, pulling on threads.
Or he would just tweet it.
Yes. And if you tweet it, then others, right? So, and partly, again, the related, not only opinion, but I think less audience segregation, that it used to be easier for each country to claim a victory because the other side's domestic wouldn't, you wouldn't know as quickly, as vividly what the other side is saying. Now, I fear, the cable news, as they have the White House spokesperson saying, they'll have, the reports, what about those other reports? Too much, again, related to some of the point making about sense, too much information and in front of too many audiences can be a real problem.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a fascinating discussion. We're going to take a quick break, just about 10 minutes, because you do have a reception on the other end of the next panel, where the next panel will come in and really engage in anecdotes and analogies and kind of those lessons from practice. And so it'll be interesting to see what their take is on the situation. I'm just reminded over the course of this panel that I've told people about this project. I started with a technology project and I ended up with a psychology project. And that might be more true in more things in sort of the nuclear space and thinking about stability and escalation than I probably had processed before. But I really want to thank both of you, Dr. Singer, Dr. Jervis, for helping us kind of pull apart both the technology and the psychology behind this. And we get to hand it over to the next panel to really try to make sense of this in the real world. Before we do that, please join me in thanking our panelists. Great. We'll just take a quick break, set up the other
Everyone, please take your seats. And thank you everyone for joining us for the second panel of today's discussion. My name is Eric Brewer. I'm the Deputy Director and Fellow here at the Project on Nuclear Issues at CSIS. And today, sort of the second panel, as opposed to the first, which as Rebecca mentioned, was really focused more on the theory of decision making and technology and some of the big picture items there. This is really focused on the, from a practitioner perspective, from those who have, who have provided the intelligence briefings, who have been in the situation rooms, who have had to make some of these decisions, and the two panelists we have here with us today have a wealth of experience on both of those topics. And so the goal of this panel is really twofold. First, we want to get the panelists' views on how crisis decision making plays out and exactly what matters in that context, right? And how that is changing with some of the new technologies that are being developed in field and how that's impacting strategic situational awareness. And second, I think try and grapple a little bit more with some of the policy challenges that we've teased out in our report, and also that were identified in the first panel about how are these new technologies changing the risks of escalation, or are they changing the risks of escalation in a conflict between nuclear armed states? And so look forward to your thoughts there. So let me go ahead and introduce our two panelists. I'm joined by Avril Haynes. Avril Haynes is the Deputy Director of Columbia World Projects, a lecturer in law at Columbia Law School, and a senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory. She was appointed by President Obama to serve as a member of the National Commission on Military, National, and Public Service, and serves on a number of boards and advisory groups, including the Nuclear Threat Initiative's Bioadvisory Group, the Board of Trustees for the Vodafone Foundation, the Advisory Board for Foreign Policy for America, and the Refugees International Advisory Council. Prior to joining Columbia University, Avril served as assistant to the president and principal deputy national security advisor to President Obama, and before that she served as the deputy director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Avril also held a number of senior legal positions in the government, including legal advisor to the National Security Council, head of the treaty office at the Department of State, as deputy chief counsel for the U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, and as a legal officer at the Hague Conference on Private International Law. Avril received her bachelor's in physics from the University of Chicago and a law degree from the Georgetown University Law Center. To her left, your right, is Kathleen Hicks. Kath Hicks is senior vice president, Henry A. Kissinger Chair and Director of the International Security Program here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Dr. Hicks is concurrently the Donald Moran Scholar at the Kissinger Center for Global Affairs, Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. She's also a member of the Board of Trustees for the Aerospace Corporation and serves on several nonprofit advisory boards. Previously, she served in the Obama administration as Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy and Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Strategy, Plans, and Forces. She led the development of the 2012 Defense Strategic Guidance and the 2010 Quadrennial Defense Review. She also oversaw Department of Defense contingency and theater campaign planning. She has received Distinguished Service Awards from 3 Secretaries of Defense and a Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the DoD Senior Professional Women's Association Excellence in Leadership Award, and the 2018 Walter Beach Award from the National Capital Area Political Science Association. She holds a PhD in political science from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, an MPA from the University of Maryland, and an AB from Mount Holyoke College. So please join me in welcoming our two panelists. I'll pose the first question. I want to step back and sort of address a couple of issues that came up in that first one, the first session. One of our takeaways from our study was that, and this came up again in that last panel, was that the risk of escalation looms large with decision makers as they think through what steps they can take to potentially acquire more information in a crisis environment. We talked about the example, again in the last panel and in the report, how sometimes policymakers put what we call guardrails on the deployment of these technologies, right? So you can fly the UAV over to acquire information, but it has to stay in international airspace. You can't put it over adversary territory, for example, right? And so using these capabilities or not using them shapes that information and can shape that crisis environment. So I want to hear, in your experience, how do policymakers think about the risks of conflict escalation during a crisis? And how should they think about those risks? Avril, we'll start with you.
Sure. So, I think it's a serious, generally you're trying to de-escalate if you're in a crisis and there's been a provocation of some sort, right? And you're sort of then within that trying to balance a whole series of interests. I mean, one is to kind of maintain the balance of power. So how do you ensure that, for example, if another country is pushing you, there's a provocation and they've taken action that is adversarial of some sort, that they're not changing where essentially the tie is at the time, right? What's the status quo? You want to get back to the status quo, so you want to reassert, in effect, without escalating. So that's one piece of it. Another one is you want to ensure that as you're acting, you're deterring additional aggressive behavior going down the line, right? So one of the things that we've seen in the context of recent discussions about Iran, there were a number of sort of aggressive actions taken by Iran, and there was concern that Trump wasn't responding for a while. People were saying, well, that's just going to encourage them to continue taking aggressive action, right? So how do you manage that kind of an issue? Another issue that I find was frequently a concern as you were going through these types of crises, you're not just managing escalation between yourself and the other country, you're also managing escalation between allies and partners in the region and the other country. So for example, in the context of the DPRK, you're worried about what will South Korea's actions be, and if we take action to push back, that might manage the potential for South Korea to push back in a way that might be less controlled or more concerning for an escalatory cycle. So that's another one. Another one is you're concerned with domestic politics and the public reaction. So you're trying to manage essentially those issues, and again, not just for your own country and the other country, but also for partners and allies and folks that are in the region, those additional spaces. So you've got a whole series of things that you're worried about in the context of the particular crisis. And then the last thing I'll mention is you want to make sure that the steps you're taking are thoughtful, in a sense, in relation to other policy objectives that you have surrounding the crisis. So, for example, you might have a non-proliferation policy objective. You want to make sure that the kinds of actions you're taking here are not going to have implications for other policies like that that might be concerning in the long term.
Well, let me first say, I did not know until today that Avril had an undergraduate degree in physics, so I will now defer all technology questions to her going forward.
Yeah, that's a mistake. Theoretical physics. It was not highly technical.
It's like Dr. Jervis and the theoretical escalation. Yes. I think you can say in general that there's a desire not to escalate it, but obviously it's very leader dependent and situation and context dependent, and we've seen that play out across multiple administrations in different contexts. And I think the way Rebecca Hersman sort of talked on the last panel about risk aversion or sort of risk incapacitation is sort of the line of where you see differences, whether folks are looking for potentially tactical escalation in the event, in the immediate crisis, in order to achieve some kind of a longer term de-escalation, or if there's a true inability to think past the risks. This gets much more complicated, of course, in the particular issues that you're concerned about in this project, which is the nuclear realm. When nuclear states are involved, I would say in general the desire strategically is to not escalate, even if in the immediate crisis there's a desire to manage the situation in a way that might actually be different than getting back to status quo. Again, it depends very much on what the context is. So what I have observed, yes, is that you can find certain sets of leaders in certain organizational constructs and in certain international relations environments, if you will, in a structural sense, where the United States has very much wanted to avoid escalation, and for very good reason. But I do think there are times and places, and we've seen some of that play out, where there is a willingness, even when nuclear states are involved, to do some take on some risk of escalation because it's in the pursuit of achieving a significant national security interest.
Thank you. I think those are both great points. And to tease one thing that you said, Kath, and I think it links back to the other panel, you talked about, I think, policy guidance have an important role there to play. You talked about perhaps personality. I think you said it could differ depending on the administration. What other factors, I think, contribute to that, and how, risk is evaluated within that group? Because I think the other panel talked a lot about decision-making bias, perhaps. What role does that play? What role does the historical analogy play? Like, I mean, when decision makers walk into that room, how much of their sort of their brain is being dominated by historical analogy about the last crisis, about what the president said 4 days ago or 5 days ago about what this policy is, versus what their whatever organization they're representing in that meeting, what their goals are. Can you give a little bit of like color to that, like what really drives that process and that evaluation of risk? Not to push too hard.
Well, I'll start and say in a good, well-functioning system, there are mitigations in place for all the things you just talked about, all of which are there. Bias of past experience of the individuals, the cultural predilections of the agency or bureaucracy or department, the concern about political ramifications that have occurred in prior analogies, et cetera. But this is where it sounds so Washington to say this, but this is where a process really can help, because any individual in those, let's just say it's the Situation Room at that level of crisis, hopefully is standing upon the work of many people with many detailed understandings that are coming together and fusing. And so I think sometimes we think about these crisis decision-making situations as involving, in sort of the Cuban Missile Crisis way, it's the people in the room and you want to be in the room where it happens, to use the Hamilton line. And that would be unfortunate, frankly, in many ways. I hope that's not where we are now. It feels like we're a little closer to that now maybe than before. But I think when you have the ability to rely on experts, Avril and I were sort of laughing in the back about raising the policymakers' IQs, and
we'd like to do that.
That's a good
for
thing.
Ourselves.
That's a really good thing. But the policymakers never going to have all that information. It is too much information, and so you need to have systems, processes, and capabilities and people in place to help you sort through all of that. So, I mean, to pick just any analogy that's not directly related to the issue of nuclear weapons, I mean, I can think back to actually you were probably also in the room, sort of the Boston bombing period, where you were trying to think through what was the information that was appropriate for the government to have, what were the things that we needed to know in order to make sure we were protecting citizens' rights, make sure we were protecting against any future attacks, but also being able to execute an investigation and an intelligence operation. So you needed a lot of people with different points of view there. You needed law enforcement at the table, but also the intelligence community, which are, if you don't know, are often in some intentional friction over the difference between enforcement and intelligence gathering. You had to have individuals who were lawyers, like Avril in the room, who understood where the limits of the federal law were, et cetera. And you needed to have people who were looking at it from a national security perspective, perhaps like DOD, who were trying to understand the links between what might be happening domestically and what might be happening overseas, et cetera, et cetera. So when you have a system that functions well, it depressurizes that immediate need for the people in the room to make the perfect decision at that moment. And the theme, I think, that came through in the first panel, which I would emphasize 100 times over, is creating space and time. It's not always possible in order to be effective, but creating space and time can really help all those human cognition and psychology issues that are inevitable that policymakers have to deal with.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with everything Kath just said, and then just emphasize that last point a little bit more and then maybe turn it to a different part of the puzzle. I think there's no question I saw over and over again in the context of a crisis, there's an initial reaction to push back. That was sort of the initial constant reaction of the folks sitting around the table. And with time, you get more nuanced. You first of all get more information. Almost always the first information is wrong, and you need to get the right information, or at least better information than you had to begin with. And then there's a further discussion and an opportunity to talk things through with folks who are behind you that are smart in your buildings, who are thinking through different options, et cetera, and coming back together. And the conversation evolves, and you get to a better answer. And so that time period is really critical, I think, to getting to a better answer, in effect. And certainly one that's more thought through. That's one piece. On the other side of things, I'd also say it's interesting thinking through how other parties are doing the same thing that you're doing. So in other words, looking at it from the perspective of the other country and what are their biases that are coming into the room and the particular leaders that are there and so on, and how are they thinking about it is another crucial aspect of things. Getting historical context, as you point out, not just your own historical context, right, but the historical context that they're dealing with, how it is that they're likely to not just understand your reaction, but react to it as a consequence of that. And all of those pieces, I think, are another part of the puzzle. But I loved Rebecca's comment in the last discussion about the fact that she started with the technology project and ended up with the psychology project. And I think it's really true. It's remarkable how much that comes into play in the context of decision making. And I guess it's obvious in some respects, but for a physicist, not so much.
That's a great point. I want to also touch on this debate that I think is, it's out there. It was also part of the last panel. It's also been part of this project, right? And that is sort of the debate about whether or not some of these technologies and the way they're sort of remaking the information environment is a revolutionary process or an evolutionary process. And I think, there's an argument to be made that given the array of new technologies, given their proliferation, given the way they can be combined on different platforms, the number of sensors that are out there, Dr. Singer talked about this, and the way that information can be conveyed is really changing the decision-making environment, right? So when you're sitting there in the situation room, the way that information is conveyed, the amount of information that's conveyed, and the level of detail, perhaps, that it's even conveyed at is truly perhaps revolutionary. I want to get your take and your reaction to this, and we can start with Kath this time. In what ways do you see that future decision-making environment and the challenges decision makers will face as being different from the current one? And you can use whatever time you'd like, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now. And in what ways do you think that some of those challenges that you described actually just moments ago will be the same?
So I do think there's a significant revolution in technology, and it's diffuse and it's multifaceted across many different types of technologies, has huge effects on how we think about power, how we think about the US role in the world and the ability to secure it, all those things. Massive, I would call that revolutionary. As to its effects on decision making, I think for now, it's evolutionary, which is to say, there are some constancies to the human condition that really pull through, that thread through to the current time, and the degree to which they have to be adjusted to deal with really the flow of information, that's one thing, but also the challenges to having set signaling and approaches. To me, I think there's more constancy in that for the decision maker. So if I were to pick something like AI and the possibilities that AI presents, if you're thinking 10 years ago, 5 years ago even, about trying to understand them, let's pick the motivations of the Chinese with their, what you might call hybrid activities, from their efforts at island building and militarization to jumping to other things they're doing in the economic realm, et cetera. Of course, what your intel officers are out there doing is trying to do pattern recognition. Of course, what your policymakers are trying to do is weigh the degree to which this merits a response. Is it national security? If you were to do that 10 years, even hopefully 5 years in the future, if you had the capability where you're teaming your intel analysts with really strong AI, hopefully they're going to see those patterns earlier. Both the false flag patterns of don't worry about this, and this is curious, there's things going on in the economic realm, political coercion realm, they're buying up this or that politician, and oh, by the way, even though they say they're not militarizing the bases, actually we can see geospatially, actually everyone can see geospatially that they're doing that. I think those sorts of examples demonstrate the ways in which you're going to see technology. And again, you can talk about bio, you can talk about lots of other areas where we're seeing this, where there are really opportunities, I guess I would say, as well as risks to us.
I think on the revolutionary side, as Kat said, in terms of how technology is affecting us, some of the things that I think about are related to the fact that individuals can wield such enormous destructive power in today's world in a way that they couldn't, many years ago, in a sense. The fact that social media has made it possible for political movements to go from sort of 0 to 60 in a relatively short period of time and change the landscape in a variety of ways. And I mean, I think there's a whole series of places where you sort of see technology having this enormous impact on the way we do things. In terms of a decision-making piece, I agree. I think on the one hand, we see more complex threats. We see them developing quite quickly, and we see ones that are across the world of increasing concern to us more quickly, and as a consequence, we're dealing with more on a sort of day-to-day basis that has to be thought through in a more complex way, as you say, requiring more information, more thinking, more variety of innovation to sort of deal with, and they're evolving very quickly, and all of those things are I think, true. But at the same time, you know, as we were discussing, many of the tools, it seems to me, that you use for managing the decision-making space are really the same. It's just using it in different, you know, you use this paradigm and you bring it over to what we're dealing with now. So for example, this question of setting a baseline, I think that was discussed in the last discussion, which is a critical thing, right? Like, so if we're doing surveillance with technology or any kind of surveillance, frankly, you sort of have a baseline for your surveillance. You might have you know, ships that are maintaining surveillance, right? And you send them through certain waters on a regular basis. And because you're doing it on a regular basis, that becomes a baseline, and the other country understands that's your surveillance, right? And that's not a hostile act per se, right? So you maintain that baseline. Well, in technology, we are developing those kinds of baseline things, and they're new, and so as they evolve, there's a little bit of instability, but you have to think through what are the baselines that you want to create. That's a way to kind of manage the issue, right? And I think similarly, you know, you have a series of things that you want to do in this space. You want to develop standards. You want to be able to develop messaging that makes sense in this context. You want to think about how you understand the use of it. And I think one of the differences in some respects, but also not entirely different, is this kind of cognitive bias that we have in technology. Well, there's cognitive bias that's relevant specifically to types of technology and the way we approach it, but there's cognitive bias in pretty much everything. And, you know, the reality is we have lots of bias in our own decision-making system. Some of it's legitimate, some of it's illegitimate. You know, you sort of have to figure out, as a lawyer, I'm going to be biased to talk about the law. That's good, but, you know, that's still something that people have to understand and recognize, and I shouldn't be doing it in a way that has illegitimate bias associated with it. So I think there's a whole series of ways in which we should be thinking about these things. And then the final one I'll mention too is just, I think, this idea that there's so much information coming in, and no policymaker is going to be capable of really understanding every aspect of that information. I think that's true. I think that's true 10, 20 years ago, frankly. I think that's certainly true today. But you do have to then develop systems that you think are credible for interpreting that information in a way that helps you get to the relevant information that you have a certain amount of confidence in a decision-making process. And that's still true today.
That's a really good point. And I think, you know, one of the things that we observed in the report, and that's sort of in the key findings, is this issue of precedence, right? And how do you start using some of these technologies now? How do you use them in peacetime? Does that set that baseline? Does that set that precedent of how you would use them in a conflict? Does the adversary have a similar understanding of what that means? So I think these are all, to your point, which is a very good point, of these sorts of challenges that I think we're all sort of grappling with. I want to talk about the issue of bias and the issue of basically trustworthiness in technology, and how we go about thinking about how do we evaluate the credibility of information, whether or not it is something that we should trust, and whether or not this is, given these new technologies, whether or not we need to change how we do that, right? Are there new risks here? For example, we talked about the explainability problem with AI in the last panel, right? And in a lot of the scenarios that we ran as part of the tabletop exercise, shocker, policymakers had a tough time believing the outputs that would come out of the AI system that we made up as part of our simulation, because they couldn't understand, why the AI made that decision. But I think it's also fair to say, and I would welcome your pushback on this point, that sometimes it's hard for humans to explain why they made certain decisions that they made, right? And for intelligence analysts that are in the room, right, to say, here's my assessment, I have, this is highly likely or this is highly unlikely, when pressed, they could probably provide some data points and explain it, but is that any more explainable than, than the AI to some degree, right? And so how do we evaluate which of those is more credible and which of those is more trustworthy? And I think also, we talked a lot about the proliferation of social media use and sort of open source intelligence. How do we evaluate the credibility of that information compared to more traditional sources of intelligence, right? Human intelligence and signals intelligence. Is it sort of the same challenge of mitigating, disinformation and CI threats and that sort of thing, or is it altogether something completely different? That's kind of a big sort of open-ended couple of questions, but maybe I'll start with you, Avril, from the intelligence side, and then we can go to Kath to talk about some of that.
Okay, all right. I mean, I think something that was really instructive to me as I sort of got into the intelligence world, so to speak, and reading products and so on, is that somebody said to me once, who had over 40 years experience in intelligence work, you should never be reading the raw intelligence. Right? Like, you should always read the analytic product, because the analysts really have a mechanism for determining essentially the credibility of what they're reading in the raw intelligence. They've spent a lot of time thinking about how it is that you approach that and producing analysis that then is something you can absorb as a policymaker and rely on with a certain amount of confidence, right? And they indicate what that confidence level is in their analytic products. And there's really some value to that, because you recognize that there's a desire sometimes, particularly in crises, right, to pull on the raw intel, and you think you've got the smoking gun or the issue that really should change, right? Yeah. But you really need to read it in context, right? I mean, you know that when you read, somebody's conversation, for example, in one small moment, right? Like, it can be taken completely out of context if you don't know that person, you don't know the way they talk or how they, right? All of those kinds of things. It's the same thing with intelligence more generally. That's true for a whole series of different things, right? And the kind of information that you're getting needs to be appropriately analyzed and put together in a way that then you should and feel confident you can rely on. I think one of the challenges in technology, at least from my experience, so I think that's true of open source, frankly, and and there are ways to deal with that across both open source and not open source. But when it comes to technology, one of the challenges that I saw is that, and this was mentioned in the last panel too, it's not just about policymakers getting smarter about technology and understanding what it is they can rely on and what they can't, and recognizing that there are some things they don't understand, but nevertheless they should be confident about, right? I don't necessarily know how the radar works, but I know that it is, X percentage likely to be correct when it does X, right? That sort of thing. But it's also true that technologists, I think, need to know more about policy. And part of the challenge is that in both directions, we need to be able to issue spot more effectively. So the kinds of risk that normally would be highlighted by technologists, I find, would be the kinds of risks like, will the technology work or not work, right? What is the sort of risk to human beings? Those things are things that normally technologists will recognize that's a critical issue, right? But they won't necessarily recognize the political risk associated with using the technology in a particular way because of the way the culture will absorb it. Or they won't recognize necessarily that going into this space is a challenge, or that using, for example, the infrastructure of another country to get to the country that you're most interested in is a relevant issue for people to understand from a policy perspective, until you've kind of gone through it once or twice and you start to see, or something goes wrong and you find out, gee, that was a critical issue we should have understood and known about, right? So there's that kind of process that I think will give us all more confidence over time, but that's something where I feel there is a sort of basic education that could be useful.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Avril just said. I would kind of point to two specific items that I think are worth highlighting in that. And the first is, if somebody's buying a car, they're going to kick the tires. A policymaker is going to ask questions. So I find it odd to imagine that an app will arrive and they'll say, oh, okay, that works well. I mean, that's good for the Russians if that's how we operate, right? But hopefully, whether it's a human analyst or it's technology derived, even if they're looking at a picture, they're going to be asking questions. So we shouldn't have this expectation that policymakers are going to be accepting of any data as final. So that's the first thing, which is, of course, there's going to be some kind of process of familiarization of, do I trust this radar? What does the radar do? Can you explain the radar to me? I mean, there are some policymakers who I know who would go into great detail. They would enjoy the radar discussion. But I think the Intel community should be very open to that. Not all policymakers will do that, but we should see that as healthy, right? To understand, well, what is that AI algorithm and how often has it been right and how have we used it before? Very normal questions, just like, how's that analyst? Is she right most of the time? How many presidents has she advised? Same kind of thing. So I actually don't think that's a bias about technology. I think that's about how people and decision makers in this case process information. And the other thing I would say is, to Avril's point, you know, the Intel piece of it really should be about building a case, for lack of a better way to put it. You don't want to be relying on one thing. What makes something trustworthy is that you have multiple reinforcing trusted streams in support. And so I think it's really important for US national security that we are building that structure, that we can assure the policymaker, whether it's a human or a technology, that there are many reliable, trustworthy things that help us understand the context of that situation in the way that the analyst is trying to present it.
To pull on one of those threads, what advice would you give those sort of intelligence officials or technology operators, perhaps those designing some of these systems, who need to explain this information to policymakers, right? What do they need to know about how policymaking works so that they can better sort of do what you both were just talking about? Any specific thoughts on, like, hey, you're designing this thing, this is great, let me tell you something, like, this is the process that you're feeding into.
Well, I would just say, I think people learn differently, first and foremost. Many people learn best through experiential approaches, and so where I have seen it successful is when you're sitting the person down and you're actually demoing. That could be like, think of it like a flight simulator, but there are certainly many examples where you're actually trying to show them, sitting at the let's say computer terminal, what it looks like to be exposed to this particular technology. So I think experiential learning is a big piece that a technologist can or an operator can easily bring to the policy, typically easily bring to the policymaker. And I can think of instances where I have asked those questions and people have come and they've walked through the technology and it was very cool, and there is definitely, policymakers are geeks like anybody else, you know, they like cool factor, so that's a way to help win over the policymaker. And again, I just emphasize, don't resist them asking questions. If someone's asking you questions, they care enough to ask the question, like lean into that. That is a potential advocate for advancing in that field.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think the communication is sort of part of the most critical piece of it. But the other thing too, I just don't, you know, this question of can we better educate both fields more effectively in a sort of a streamlined way, right? Because I'm not going to become a technologist, I'm a policy really, and vice versa, and that makes perfect sense. And I do think, you know, something that was said before, I guess that some of the reactions, you know, of the technologists, like, I don't understand what these policy people are talking about, why they're making these questions, et cetera, is something that resonates with me in the sense that when I came from physics and I went to law school, I remember it was really like I had to re-engineer the way I thought. You know, I sort of was used to looking for the answer, trying to understand the physical world, trying to create models through math, you know, for what actually happens, right? All of these things. There were answers in my world, right? And in law, you know, you're basically looking for the least bad option. And it's sort of, it's a kind of a fascinating new way of thinking. And I think there's some truth to the fact that we do think differently. We look for different frames for how we approach things and problem solving. And there's some value in just trying to understand that as you're recognizing, you know, these issues, because I think there's an instinct among some technology, for example, in answering questions of policymakers to make categorical answers, and policymakers instantly distrust those. And, you know, there's like so it's a fascinating, you know, the communication is actually not seamless, let's just say. It's an important piece of it.
Yeah, and I would say
yeah, I was just going to add, one thing I should have made clear too is that, you know, we are very aware as policymakers that when you ask questions, certain people can imply mistrust, and this gets to the micromanagement issue of what's micromanagement, and which there is definitely micromanagement.
You're getting ahead. I have all these micromanagement questions later, but go ahead.
Yeah, oh, okay. Yeah. Well, I was just going to say, what is micromanagement and what is communication? Look, we will trust each other more if we are sharing and communicating, and it helps the intel analysts do a better job if they understand what the policymaker is, even if they can't articulate it yet. What are they trying to understand that they can't quite get yet?
I think too, you know, again, drawing on the experiences of this project, we saw, I think Rebecca mentioned at the outset, we basically divided people into two groups. There was the policy group, there was the intel group, and the intel group came in with this sort of proposed collection plan, right? We saw a lot of dialogue back and forth, right? I think some of the frustrations from the collectors in this scenario are perhaps from some of those questions, right? Some of those really tough questions that I think come in from the policy community. And so I think there was that element of realism for sure with what we did, because there was a lot of that dialogue. I want to move away from I think the focus on technology, that we've had so far in our discussion, and I want to talk a little bit more about this blurring of the line between the conventional and the nuclear realms. That came up in the last discussion. It's sort of a key element of the project that in a variety of ways, the conventional and nuclear dimensions are getting more blurry. This is true when we look at strategic situational awareness. It's true when we start, thinking about countries that are doing some of the commingling of nuclear conventional forces. In a lot of ways, this pot is getting more mixed and more convoluted. So I want to get your take on how should we think about that line between conventional and nuclear crisis, if there even is a line anymore. Is it sort of, when the bombers are put on alert? Is every conventional conflict inherently have a nuclear dimension because of that nuclear shadow between nuclear armed adversaries? So I want your thoughts on that. Where is that line? What does that dynamic look like? And then what are the implications for planning and for crisis management as part of that?
You want to start with me?
That's sure, yeah. You look like you're ready to go.
You're looking at me.
Yeah.
Well, I can't top Peter Singer's Taylor Swift deterrence theory. That was pretty good. But I'll go back a couple decades, as is my wont, and use Spinal Tap. There is a fine line between stupid and clever. And I think that this is a very blurred area, the conventional nuclear. And as the conventional world, I'm someone who lives across both, if you will. In the conventional world, there's this clever emphasis that it makes complete sense in a conventional sense, which is what are the ways, the operationalization that you can do, horizontal escalation, cross-domain approaches. What are the ways you can kind of tackle problems that are new and creative? That can get you to a war-winning, if you will, strategy. And of course, they're not steeped in the nuclear world. And by the way, completely true vice versa. The nuclear world oftentimes really does not concern itself with what is happening and actually is quite hostile to the conventional world in some aspects of that nuclear world. And vice versa. So I think there is a real challenge here that you all highlight in your report on the need for integration. I think the blurriness is real and it is very dangerous. I think miscalculation is the primary thing I worry about. There are other reasons that nuclear powers can escalate. But miscalculation, I think, tops the charts right now for me, as I don't think there are any two nuclear states that are seeking to actually escalate to nuclear war. So what do you do about that? And I think you all highlighted a number of the things that can be done. First is that education and combination process. We have these I'll just use an example. We have these separate strategy processes historically in DoD. We have a nuclear posture review. We have a missile defense review. We have whatever you want to call it of the day. Right now it's the national defense strategy process. It's been called different things at different times. And they're all kind of separate. They sort of connect, but not totally. The gaming is usually separate. We've got StratCom games, and we've got sort of the theater commander game level games. And occasionally they'll cross over, but not very often. The strategic level might integrate a little, so you have cyber and space and nuclear, but not with the conventional. I think that's a real challenge, and I've seen it play out in a variety of different ways. I remember when I was on the National Commission for the National Defense Strategy, I was talking to a DoD official doing our interviews for it, and I was talking about the Europe challenge set, and I asked this explicit question about, after they had sort of briefed me on all the concerns of the conventional level, and I said, well, how does nuclear play into this? And there was a pause, and the person said to me, to be honest with you, we have not gotten that far on that issue. And I thought, ooh, this was post-Crimea too. Ooh, that's not a good thing. I'm sure they've made a lot of progress since then. So that's just very telling that even in the midst of essentially a crisis of a nuclear state having undertaken an annexation of foreign territory, there really hadn't been, at least in this one official's mind, a significant look at the nuclear level and how it played into potential conventional eventualities. So that piece of it is very important. I think to the extent that you have the ability to separate, separation is good. I agree with your fundamental conclusion in the report that commingling is inevitable, if you will, but I think it can be lessened, it can be minimized, and it can be clarified. Where is it commingled? How is it commingling? And what are those parameters, those policy rule sets about the use of those dual capable or commingled capabilities? And so then I just end more generally on that point, which I think Avril started to raise too, which is about your rules and norms and signaling, all the things we are so far behind on in so many domains and new areas of warfare. I think those have to be, that involves talking to adversaries or potential adversaries. It involves working with allies, creating things like hotlines, exercising, lots of ways you can signal. Creating the baselines, I think, is a huge piece of it, frankly, to just sort of maintain what is normal status quo, what is something new and different. So let's get on that. We focus so much, I think, in the United States on the technology side of it and very little emphasis on the policy side of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll just try to add a few little things because, frankly, I think Kath did a phenomenal job of sort of answering this question more generally. First of all, there were 2 exercises. I wonder if it was because of you in the last 2 years where we actually went through the nuclear piece. But in any event, a critical aspect. I'll also just on this setting the baseline piece, I just want to sort of come back at that in another way, which is to say that I think this is one of the hardest things to do from a policy perspective because there's almost never a good time to do something that's not your norm, right? Like, so when you're setting a new baseline, you're essentially, you have that destabilizing moment essentially when you're starting it. And you need to do it carefully and you need to sort of begin to develop not just a strategy so that the other country doesn't misinterpret what you're doing in this process, but also to get your policy community used to the baseline. Because if you're looking at a particular issue, right, at the moment, the last thing you want to do is add weight to the relationship or to the concerns or all those things. So if you don't develop that kind of baseline muscle, and really stick to it, it's very hard to do. And then you find that you don't have the information you need at the moment when you have the crisis that really helps you sort of manage, miscommunication, miscalculation, all of the things that we don't want to engage in. So that's one piece. And then finally, yes, on the line between nuclear and conventional, agree with everything. And I guess the only thing I'll just expand on, I think from my perspective, is that given how effective our conventional weapons are today and the sort of superiority that the United States has in this area, frankly, it's very hard to imagine a scenario in which you would want to willingly escalate into the nuclear space, right? I mean, it is, first of all, if you can take the destruction, right, that you want to take with your conventional forces, right? If you don't do nuclear, then first of all, you will have greater legitimacy from an international perspective. In other words, your allies and partners are more likely to see your action, presuming, of course, that you're doing it in response to an attack or some other provocation that justifies it. So that's one. 2 is you're not going to unintentionally escalate it into a whole new realm where, frankly, our superiority is not as critical in a sense. In other words, our conventional superiority is unmatched. The question of then matching it in the nuclear space is less effective for obvious reasons, right? And so there's just a whole series of reasons why if you can do what you want to do through a conventional space, there's no need to go into the nuclear, which just clarifies and reinforces the point that it is important to not blur that space for all of the reasons that your report identifies. I mean, I think that's just another way to look at it.
So I want to get in a little bit more to this issue of micromanagement that we talked about. I think it's kind of in the eye of the beholder, right? On whether it's micromanagement or whether it's management. And so, one of the things that's come up in the conversation, one of the things that has come up in the report is because of the novelty of some of these technologies, because of their potential to be perceived either by the user or by the recipient, right? The observed state as being escalatory, there could be more micromanagement issues associated with it. So from your perspective, what are some guidelines for managing that process, right? And getting that level of micromanagement right? How do we really balance the sort of, I guess, the operational risks of escalation that could be associated with some of these technologies with the broader political objectives that you're trying to achieve in any given crisis or conflict?
You want to start with me? Okay.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll just give a few thoughts on this. One is, in the context of given that we're sort of focused on surveillance technology, although obviously this applies across a range of areas, one of the challenges I find is once you say a new technology is being developed and you're working it through, right? That's a time when presumably you're going to, in effect, do a little bit more micromanaging, right? You sort of want to understand it. You want to make sure that you understand the aspects of it that are most likely to develop risk for you and to trigger other issues that are unintended or unacceptable. And so then you try to find a framework for essentially triggers that help you to know when it's getting out of line, right? Or when it is doing something that other people who aren't the people who are managing it might have information that would trigger a concern for them, right? So in other words, you may say, here's the sort of regular order thing that you need to do, right? We understand that you're doing this on a regular basis. When you go into these areas, you need to get a higher level approval because that person is going to have information you don't have, and they may therefore decide that that's not a good time to do it, or they'll have some reason for why it is that they need to at least be weighed in, or they need to be aware of it so that they're managing other things. There's a whole series of reasons, right? So you sort of begin to set up this framework. And I think that's that's sort of the ideal, is that then you don't micromanage, you allow people to do what they need to do within a certain amount of space, but then when they get into other areas where that they don't necessarily have the information to address, somebody else looks at it, or if something goes wrong, or things that help you to understand, like, yes, it's on track and we're monitoring it and it's working. The other reason why you want to bring it up that I think is useful once you have your framework is that you also want to educate your higher level policymakers about the things that are happening. So in other words, it's very easy for intel collection, for example, to go sort of below the wire, right? And then in a crisis, you go, well, what do you mean you have people in these places, or this is going on, or this is the kind of collection that's happening, and so on. And it's actually very useful for higher level folks to have some sense of the landscape. And so sometimes you may want it done for that reason and sort of just have some understanding, and higher level approvals can sometimes do that for you. Sometimes you can set up those approvals in ways that are less onerous or less concerning. You have a certain amount of time within which to respond, or tacit approvals, that sort of thing. If you don't object, it will happen, that sort of thing. But then the flip side of micromanagement, right, which is a scenario in which you ask so many questions and you require so many approvals that the people who are doing the work, who should be taking responsibility for the work, don't feel as if they're no longer feel empowered, and therefore, in a way, the sort of, the bad side of micromanagement, in my experience, is that then they start to rely on those higher level approvals as essentially abdicating their judgment, in effect, right? And that is a concern. And I have seen that happen where you start to see that If an agency's operations are too micromanaged, for example, from the White House, that they no longer, the mother may I process becomes one that is disempowering to the agency, and they sort of say, well, I figured you'd tell me if I needed to do X or things like that, and so you have to make sure that you're obviously developing that kind of balance. And I think there is, it's just, as you say, it's in the eye of the beholder. There's no question that, I think I've disagreed with people when people have said there's micromanagement or in the other direction.
Right.
So I don't think there's any, I have been on both sides of that conversation. But I do think there's ways to set up frames that help you, and I just see a whole series of reasons why those frames are important that even go beyond, in effect, the sort of, general stuff that you think of, like the educational piece to it.
I agree, period. The operations are meant to be in support of something, right? They're not an end to themselves. And so I think it's always important to remember that truism, because the goal of the operations is to advance some kind of policy. So I think when you're the policymaker, the key questions you want to be asking are, is this operation in support, in general terms, are we on a series of operations that are in support of a broader goal that's been clearly set, let's say in this case by the President, Secretary of Defense, whatever the mission set is. And then is my desire for information, which by the way, I do think to some extent the technology makes it insatiable because we can get more and more information. So I do think there's a real temptation there. So then the policymaker, it's incumbent upon him or her to say, am I impeding the way in which that operation can advance that goal? So that strategy operational link, I think, is the key piece, and it is a balancing act between making sure, doing your duty as a policymaker to ensure that there is a connection, but also understanding that you can get in the way of that. Now, risk comes in, period, and so how you weigh risk, whether it's risk of civilian casualty, whether it's risk in the case of situational awareness of an international incident, or heightening tensions that, because this particular form of collection or reconnaissance creates friction with a country or even allies. Those are all things you have to weigh in that are appropriate for the policy-making level to weigh. But the vast majority of things you're doing in situational awareness kind of fall in what Avril was describing as sort of routine activities that should not trip that. So it should be the exception to the case, and there will always be, I think, this natural tension between policymakers and operators. And I think the goal is to just make sure it aligns ultimately to what it is you're trying to achieve.
So it sounds like having these conversations sooner rather than later is better, right? Particularly with some of these novel technologies that could be used in ways that perhaps not everybody is cognizant of at the moment, right?
And it changes. This is a difficult area to talk about in any detail, but I'll just say, let's just take in general cyber. You can think of, we're at different points in terms of the transparency, the ability of different actors, to see, including us, to see what's happening. So as the technology itself evolves, as decision-making evolves here and elsewhere, you have to be able to pace, actually hopefully be in front of that. So that's not just a conversation, just to underscore your point, at the beginning of the technology existing. It is an ongoing conversation, because the way in which there is adaptation and learning on the part of you and other actors changes that context all the time.
I've got, I think, one more question, and then we'll open it up to the group for a Q&A. And this in some ways is kind of like perhaps the most basic question, but what do or should intelligence officials and policymakers want out of these emerging situational awareness technologies, right? Is there a particular thing that would be most valuable to the decision-making process? Is it, hey, I want these technologies to give me more decision-making time so that we can have those discussions and, fingers crossed, we'll come out in a better place at the end because we've had time to debate this. Is it about granularity of information? Is it about the ability to access certain denied environments that we currently can't access? Is it about redundancy in some of these capabilities? If you sort of had to have perhaps not a magic wand, but a wish list of really, what would be most helpful for the decision-making process, particularly, given the context that we're focused on here, which is nuclear armed crises, but more generally, what would be most valuable?
I mean, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
Frankly, most of the time, the immediate is, I want to know what's happening, right? And I want to have confidence that what you're telling me is in fact what's happening, and I want to know it right away, right? So that's sort of your classic policymaker request to the Intel folks in the context of a crisis. And hopefully over time you've educated the policymakers to understand, first of all, to have sort of some sense of realism in asking those kinds of questions, because sometimes you do get policymakers who think that you're going to be able to give you this extraordinarily granular picture of what's occurring, right? And what you need to do is be very careful about what you're briefing insofar as you're indicating, here's what I do know, here's what I don't know, here's the confidence with which I know or don't know this information, and here are some of the things. So that's sort of first and foremost. The other thing that is frequently asked in those contexts is, what's their intent, right? And that's really hard. I mean, and it's something that is sort of an immediate question, right? So they're doing this, why? Why are they doing this? What do they want to accomplish? What's next? This kind of thing. And so again, imperfect answers, and yet critical information for you to have. And frankly, that's the kind of information that you're really only going to have any sense of if you've been historically managing it and understanding it. And frequently the intent is not singular, right? There's a whole series of actors in these spaces, and you're trying to understand what all of them are doing and how that's going to interact and how that will play itself out. So that's a secondary piece. Another thing is frankly getting information that helps you understand what options are. So what I mean by that is, you're in a crisis, something's happening, and you're looking for ways to respond, right? And you're also thinking about what it is that your allies and partners are doing, and your other, their allies and partners are doing, and all of those pieces, puzzle. And sometimes the responses can give you the space that you're looking for in your decision making, right? Because you have a ladder of options, or ones that are sort of surprising in the context of a crisis, that you only have because you have enough intelligence and enough information to help you understand that. So I'll just give some examples. So one, obviously in the context of the DPRK in South Korea, right, like one of the things that they've done to each other over time, although now they've dismantled the speakers, is to put on these loudspeakers across the armistice line, right, and and to broadcast information and songs and a variety of other things, right? And it's very irritating to both sides, right? But these are the kinds of things that, like, you find these types of responses in the context of a crisis. First of all, it's good to understand what they mean and why they're happening and how they're likely to affect the crisis. But you also can understand that there are different ways to respond to these things that are not just about force, that are not sort of your classic responses, because of the culture, because of the history, because of the ways in which these things happen. Another piece of it, though, is things like, if you know where they're moving their forces, or if you know what they're doing with specific types of weapons, or if you understand enough about it, it may give you alternative options for how you respond, even if you're using force. So there's just a whole series of ways in which your situational awareness can give you options that you wouldn't otherwise have in the context of a crisis, so that you can work to, frankly, achieve the objectives that you're interested in. And then finally, I think this sort of broader situational awareness that helps you understand what other people are doing around it is absolutely critical, and how you can message information across allies and partners and adversaries. Who should you be targeting with the message? How should you manage the message, right? Should it be private? Should it be public? Should it be done in a certain way? How will they react in this space versus that space? What point in their decision making are they? Those types of things are utterly critical, obviously, to being able to try to manage crisis.
Yeah, I mean, I really defer to Avril having said on the intel side of things. I think what I would say first and foremost really is motivation and intent, especially when it comes to the issue of potential nuclear escalation. We've seen that play out throughout the Cold War and beyond in terms of how important making the right call on inferring what intent was has avoided, you know, sort of the old Brzezinski story about not answering the phone or ignoring the phone call, excuse me, in the middle of the night. Those sort of things, the extent that the intel community has situational awareness capabilities that actually help better identify motivation and intent, I think that really helps miscalculation be avoided.
I think that's fascinating because arguably you could make a case that, you know, another sensor on a UUV is not going to get you that intent question, right? That comes from other types of collection methods or perhaps from some sort of advanced AI.
Can I say, well, one example of where that may not be quite right is when you know patterns of behavior, you can aggregate specific data, even if it's physical data, to help you understand. So a good example, and then, I mean, nuclear, obviously readying nuclear forces, but you can think about the creation of coups. We've seen a couple of those, or attempted coups. I mean, how do you interpret when bridges are getting blocked? And that's things intel analysts actually can bring you that, if you will forgive the term exquisite, but having better and more real-time, precise ability to have eyes on situations that are even just physical can actually help you understand motivation and intent because you understand pattern.
Yeah, fully agree. I mean, there's a lot of physical information that you'd be using to do that.
So I think we'll go ahead and do Q&A. I see first question right there. I think we've got folks with microphones. Please give your name and your affiliation.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an intel analyst and a former diplomat. I want to challenge a little bit this notion that you have to protect the policymaker from the data. Guy writes a paper, announces that country A will invade country B. He will do so using the following units. He will do so on the following weekend. Paper goes up to his boss. Country A might invade country B. It might do so in this time frame, and it might use some of the following units. Then it goes up to his boss. One of the possibilities is that country A might invade B, et cetera, et cetera. By the time the paper leaves the agency, it's already pablum, and it hasn't gone off to the laterals, the other agencies that have to take a cut at it too. This is profoundly common. And I think as a policymaker, I want to see the community product, but I want to see the original analyst's paper stapled to the back of the community product, because that's the guy who probably knows what's really going on. And it wouldn't hurt to have some of the key data sets stapled to the back of his paper. That is the thing that's going to empower a policymaker, not this thing that's completely cooked, addition, and having butchers hack here and there. So I'm just challenging that notion.
Just, sure. I don't know if you want to respond to that, but just a reminder to please have questions rather than statements.
No, but that's fine. I'm sorry I wasn't clear. What I said was that the advice that I'd gotten was don't read the raw intelligence, because frankly, you can misinterpret that quite easily if you're not an analyst who's been looking at all of the different, for example, conversations that person's been having and the way in which they interpret it. I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't look at the first analyst's product versus the second analyst's product or something like that, right? It's a different issue, and I do think that you want to ask questions and you want to be able to question whether or not whatever it is that you're receiving, frankly, is accurate and responsive to what it is that you're providing. And certainly, when it comes to data, I do think it's useful to have the raw data in some respects when you're looking at an analytic product that relates to X number of incidents per this, that type of thing. I mean, I think you should have that as part of it. But if you've got a good analytics shop, they are in fact managing those issues and making sure that it's accurately then representing what it is that the analysts indicated. So I agree with you that the analysts are the key piece. It's just the raw intel that having a policymaker without any experience or knowledge of prior stuff that's not as useful.
Policymakers always follow that guidance, right? They never read the raw intelligence, right? Never.
Yeah, no,
Okay.
I certainly read raw intel. It's true, but it's just something to be wary of, right? I mean, it's Anyway.
I saw right there. Yep, the sweater. That was the next hand that went up, I think.
Thanks, Tom Stefanik from Brookings. There's an assumption I've heard often from the AI community that AI's impact on the military will be to really speed the command and control decision process, the entire cognitive process from data collection to inference to even supporting decisions. What's your take on that? Are we currently constrained by algorithmic processing, or it doesn't sound like that, so I'm skeptical of that view, but I'd like to hear your views.
I think that squarely ends up in my lap. I think what you're hearing, I would agree with what you're hearing, which is a concern that there is a race inside what we would call the OODA loop, if you're the Air Force, but you're seeing it across the services, that there is this tightening of that information decision cycle because all parties are racing to improve their cognition with AI as an enabler. It's sort of AI enabled or machine learning enabled decision cycles, and that those are getting tighter and tighter, and that there are advantages to being the fastest inside that loop. I think that there are basically truths in that, that there is a race around AI, that part of that race is about trying to get the best information fastest so decision can be made faster, which can create some first mover advantages. Given that I think that, and I think there are plenty of others who think that, then the question becomes, okay, well, is that an inevitable, irreversible cycle, or is this where we, among many other areas like hypersonic weapons, where it's kind of time to take a little bit of pause and look out in the international environment and start to think about how we get ourselves out of the inevitability of that? I think that's a bigger question that looks a little like arms control. It's really challenging right now, or maybe looks like a set of affirmative affirmations of what the US believes the right policy choices to be, even when we are enabled to speed. So that can be more about issues of how we position ourselves in our own force posture and the types of systems that we are enabling with AI. So in other words, if it's a defensive system, if it's an Aegis capability off of a ship that is improved in its precision and timing to destroy an incoming weapon, that feels okay, right? It's a different issue if you're talking about a different kind of system that could be seen as trying to get a first mover advantage. So that's how I would describe that issue. I want to gratuitously say one other thing, which is the biggest and earliest advantages of AI for the United States military is in the, if you will, the back office side. It's logistics, it's HR, and we could use that. It's all kinds of financial systems and other areas where there are real efficiencies to be had, just like there would be in any corporation, to opening ourselves up, our IT systems, et cetera, to better be able to absorb artificial intelligence.
Anything you want to add?
No, I totally agree. Maintenance, too, I just add to her list. Yeah.
We'll go up here in the front, I think.
Thank you for your comments. I'm Joseph Wolfsheimer. I work at the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, where I help the nuclear operations and policy people understand my field, which is computer science and its application to command and control systems. I do have my question is, in the study that you, Eric, and Rebecca, and others did, to what extent were you able to include the computer science community? I know from the professional associations that I'm a member of that the IT, communications, and computer science world are very wary about wading into the policy world. One group, the Association for Computing Machinery, has its policy group compartmented off partly because they don't want to be doing any political lobbying, I believe. I don't understand the logic. I would hope that they'd be more involved. To what extent were they involved, and to what extent do you see that in future at a group like this, instead of having a lot of policy people and a few physics, we might have, since many of the technologies that you highlight in your book are related to computing and communications, how can we get that flow that's been discussed by so many speakers here? How can we get that going? Thank you.
I guess this one is to me. I think the short answer to your question is I'm not aware of including anybody from that particular community, but we did involve a range of folks who are specialists and experts in various technologies. That includes folks that were out at Berkeley, right, that were a part of this effort. It includes folks from sort of the next generation cadre. And we actually did a lot of outreach, one, within CSIS ISP and elsewhere, and then sort of outside of the organization as well, to folks that have particular expertise in particular technologies to draw on that, both for the analysis that we did in this report and some of the earlier studies, as well as for some of the tech primers that we did that sort of are rundowns on that explain some of these new technologies that you'll find on the Radar website as well. So I want to go over here. I think I saw a hand that was up. Is that?
Right, first and foremost, thank you very much. I'm Simone from the Dutch Embassy, and currently trying to unlock my phone for the question. Well, in the ecosystem of having both conventional and nuclear means at our hands, and you already rightfully said we should always try to achieve our goals with these conventional means. So I want to kind of go into the hypothetical situation of having a nuclear first strike, and would it still be credible and desirable to strike back with conventional means, and what's your opinion on that?
I can just start. I mean, I think it's absolutely viable to have conventional responses to nuclear use. I don't want to say too much here. I think all I would say is it would be my anticipation that a president would want as many options as possible, and that would include options that did not then respond or retaliate at a nuclear level. I will go further to say, personally, I do believe you can reestablish deterrence effectively without having to go to the nuclear level. So I think you can, it's all context dependent, but there are cases where not only might a president wish to have a conventional response, but that you could do a conventional response and reestablish deterrence.
Completely agree.
I know you've been waiting in the back up there, so let's go over there next.
Hi, Aaron Manis. My day job is at DHS, where I do AI policy. So your comment about putting AI into the back end, oh boy, do we need that. Two questions, one straightforward, one a little more conceptual. I did a PhD in national security process at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy, so go Terps. I also worked on modeling terrorist groups at the other end of campus. So the basic question, though, is I felt like the first panel saw this as revolutionary, that with technology now, national security decision-making has so many more dimensions, so much more information, and there's so many more challenges, and it's so much easier for our basic cognitive biases to get messed up even more by, for example, AI. The two of you who were actually involved in the national security process sounded a little bit more like it's evolutionary, that if we can build a good process, we can incorporate these new elements and maybe muddle through. More conceptually, I'm really interested in how as I began getting into AI policy, I saw government bureaucracies as sort of giant AIs with people as chips, right? And it takes a long time to make it, to query it and get it to give you the answers you want you need out of it. So now we're marrying this very slow AI with this very fast AI. And well, how's that going to play?
Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I think the cultural pieces are huge. You said at the beginning this AI ecosystem, and we actually have a report. I will just pitch forward from CSIS on the AI ecosystem. And it really is that. It's not just the, I'll repeat a little bit of what I said before, it's not just the technology. A lot of this is about culture and people. The generational aspects will help themselves. There are digital natives, and we are not they but they're coming, and I have several of them in my own home, and they're moving into the gainful employment sector, one hopes. So it will be easier in that sense, because a lot of the things that are culturally very challenging for the workforce that we have today in the federal government is easier for the workforce to come. But that said, it's still bureaucratic. And so that means you're always going to need leadership. You're always going to need good personnel policy, good training and education. And that requires, I'll just say, investment as well. And so you have to have leadership that wants to invest not just in the technology, but in everything that goes with it for the national security community. And a lot of that's about how you support the people.
Yeah, and I guess I'll take then the revolutionary, evolutionary. I mean, from my perspective, we talked about revolutionary aspects and evolutionary aspects, and I guess maybe the question is, how would our recommendations change, between the first and the second? And I'm not sure there'd be a lot of difference between us in that respect. In other words, I do think a lot has changed, right? And as I mentioned, I believe there are more complex issues coming at us more quickly. We have a whole series of challenges that we have to face in that context. I think that some of the same tools are available to us, but some new tools are going to have to be developed for our decision-making process, and I think we're going to have to be innovative. Hopefully, we're not just muddling through, but honestly, I think that's probably true for most of my history that I've been aware of. So that is probably where we're at, but always trying to keep ahead of it as much as possible.
I'll just add too, I think we could be wrong, and it might be because we're too close to it. But so what might seem ironic when you ask the question might actually be not ironic at all, but the fact that we are so close to it, it doesn't actually feel that different. We live it and we incorporate it. But we'll see. I agree. I think it's, as I said, a revolution of technology, and the effects on decision making are more evolutionary.
Other questions?
I'm Robin Walker. I'm with Lockheed Martin. Just on that last point on revolutionary versus evolutionary, I think to me when it becomes revolutionary is when you have an AI producing some kind of decision that it then can't explain, and you have to have a question of whether to trust that or not. You talked about being able to question an analyst and say, go back to the data and tell me how you came to this conclusion. And I, as a former intelligence analyst and briefer, I agree that you should not show just the raw data to a senior policymaker, but you having an analyst in the room, a briefer in the room who can explain how you got back to that is important. And if an AI program can't do that, it gives you only the conclusion and not being able to backtrack on that, I think then is when you really become revolutionary. So as a policymaker, how do you decide whether to trust that if you can't go back and ask how you get to that underlying data?
It's interesting. Maybe I have an odd perspective on this because of having started in physics. In quantum, you don't understand essentially what the answers are that are coming out of the box, really. That is, in fact, what quantum is all about in some respects. And so there's this question, though, when it comes to AI, where my mind is on, do you trust the information that's being fed in for the information that's coming out? Not necessarily that you understand exactly how the algorithm derived the answer, but one of the key challenges from an AI perspective is obviously this issue of basically bias being built into algorithms, right? And that bias, that we talk about most of the time deals with discrimination against, particular historically discriminated members of society, but it's not. But it's not just that kind of bias that you can obviously build into an algorithm. And so I do think there's a lot of hard questions that need to be asked. And one of the challenges in the context of technology is that, in these meetings, it's sometimes people feel less comfortable asking those kinds of questions than they do the kind of policy questions that they'd ask an analyst, as you're rightly pointing out. We have to get more comfortable doing that. We have to ask all the questions that we need to ask in order to feel comfortable with the answers that we're providing. I strongly believe that, at least. On the other hand, I do think there is a point at which you only have so many hours in the day, and how much you learn about how algorithms are deriving the answers, right, is going to be one of the issues you're going to have to get comfortable with on some level. But
I agree. If you're thinking ahead to some kind of general AI future, I would oppose that in terms of it taking humans out of their moral responsibility for warlike interactions. I don't believe that humanity should ever get to that point. So I will work to make sure, my small part, that I can try to prevent that from happening. So if that's what your question is really about, sort of a general AI, we welcome our robot overlords, I'm with you on that. I think that would be significantly problematic. I think, though, that there are ways to incorporate technology, and specifically AI and even quantum, in ways that are enabling to humans. But that means that we have to put an emphasis at the outset and continually on the policy piece of this and the way in which we want to frame our use around humans. And now I'm quoting Henry Kissinger basically at this point, on this point. So that's the key to me, rather than let the technology run away and the national security community to be grabbing the tail wherever it takes us.
We have time for one or two more questions if folks have them. Anything else? Going once, going twice? Okay, well, first of all, let me just, I want to say thank you to both of you, to Kath and Abril. So please join me in a round of applause for the two of you for a fantastic discussion. I want to give, if I can, unfortunately Rebecca had to run to catch a flight elsewhere, but I want to try and think of, at least for me, what were, I think, a couple of takeaways from today's conversation, right? If I had to pick three things that I think, I'll think selfishly here, that I got out of it, right? The sort of the three most important insights, it would be something along the following. And I would say, I think, we've really only scratched the surface of this conversation, obviously, and there's a lot more that can be done here. And I feel like in some ways, we always come away with more questions than answers as part of these discussions, which I think is a good thing, because it advances that state of the knowledge and gives us ideas of where else to take this. So for me, one thing that stood out is that in an era and an environment with more information and sources of information, whether you want to call it revolutionary, whether you want to call it evolutionary, there's certainly more of it and more information available. Again, going back to that issue of what do we believe in that information environment? How do we sort through what information to trust? How do we sort through what questions we want to ask collectors and intelligence officials about that information? How do we mitigate any potential biases we bring about how we think about technology? How do we look at, how do we have that conversation to make policymakers and intelligence officials more comfortable with certain technologies, as well as make the operators, I guess, have an understanding of how policy works and the types of questions they'll have. That's sort of my first macro level takeaway. The second one is going back to this theme of the human element here, essentially. And like Rebecca said, it started out as a technology project and it really became one about psychology and perception and decision making. We've tended to focus on technology, but I think here it's really about the way that human beings, the beliefs, their perceptions about these technologies and their limits, their capabilities, the management that they require, whether it's micromanagement or not, is all really fundamental to shaping how they will be used in this environment. And whether we're talking about, which Peter Singer talked about earlier, the pressure on leaders to use these in certain ways and to react in certain ways, or whether or not, there are probably ways these can be used and will be used that we haven't even thought about. And there almost certainly are ways that these will be used that we haven't even thought about. And as well, getting back to something that I heard both of you say throughout this conversation, but particularly you, Kath, is the importance of a process, which is inherently a process of people, working well. And the importance, I think, of trust, right, as part of this process. And you have to have that trust in, policy has to have the trust in the operational and the intelligence level to provide that information in a frank way. And then those who are doing the intelligence, the operational functions, have to have that trust in the policy to not abuse that management authority, perhaps in one case, right? And so the importance of that dialogue, the importance of the trust in the process to arrive at better policy solutions. And I think third is really, understanding the role that these technologies play in enhancing strategic situational awareness and how they can shape crises and conflicts. This is all kind of a journey, right? We're sort of logging one chapter in this discussion and logging one chapter as part of this report, but there's a lot more to come, right? And it's a potentially a perilous journey, right? All of this playing out some ways for the first time and under the increased risk of nuclear conflict amongst nuclear armed states. So there's a lot of learning to be had as part of this, and I think both panels talked a lot about the importance of that dialogue again between the different groups that have equities in these technologies and their use and their execution and the support of policy. And there's disparities, I think, in knowledge and in understanding of a lot of different sides of that debate. And so bridging those divides and having that conversation becomes incredibly important. And I think I'll sort of close there. Just a couple more concluding points. What we want to say thank you, first of all, to the Carnegie Corporation again for their support for this research. We want to say thank you very much to the entire CSIS Pony team for their work on pulling together this report.
Who are standing in the
Yes,
back.
who are standing in the back, and this very important conference. So a round of applause for all of you, Regia and Bryce in particular. And again, please join me in giving a round of applause to all of our panelists today. We really appreciated the discussion. Thank you for those of you who traveled to be here.